welcome back to Best Loved Films, the podcast that goes with bestlovedfilms.com. Let's begin by acknowledging that this land, the United States of America, was stewarded beautifully, and probably pronounced better, by hundreds of generations of Native Americans before any white people showed up. We want to thank them for that and promise to try and leave this land better. My name is Daniel Smith-Rousey. I am a very minor filmmaker with a PhD in film and American studies. So that sounds more like a major. And I've published 3 books about cinema and media. Today, I would like to welcome to the podcast our returning champion, an amazing film fan. Some might say fanatic. You know, I don't judge. It's Kieron Edwards, everybody. Come on. Yeah. Hey, Kieron.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction. It's always good to not just be a listener, but also be a participant here. So, and it also, your introduction that you usually give for each episode is particularly apt, giving one of the films that we're covering today as well.
Great. I forgot what you're even, you know what? I bet that'll make more sense later, knowing you.
By like the second film, I think, if we're going in order.
Right. Oh, well, hey, thank you for pointing that out. Yeah, it's good to get a plug in for the material. So how are you doing today? You all right?
I'm doing all right. I did not experience the same sort of issues maybe you might have recently this morning with your neighborhood and power outages.
We did have a power problem, so this was a little delayed, but it's all good.
Yeah.
Okay, well, all the more, go ahead. Were you going to?
Oh, no, I mean, also I'm starting to get into actually like going out to seeing films more, which is nice as well, too.
I love that.
So, yeah. So hopefully there will be more of that in the future, apart from just catching up on all of these films as well, too.
I hope you'd let me go with you in some of these cases.
Yeah, I hope you do the same as well, too. Because I don't. I think you're probably more up on the films that should be seen than I am these days. Is my guess. So my guess is with some of the films I'm looking at like older films, kind of like what we're talking about today.
Well, those two. Well, that's okay. Well, I'm never going to get a better segue to say that many, many books have made it very, very clear. Hollywood's 2 biggest transitions ever were in the late 20s and the late 60s. But the latter change was driven not only by studio failures and industrial changes, but also by the culture. Indeed, Hollywood's very idea of a movie star was evolving, as Dennis Bingham noted. Some of these stars who, quote, lost the bankability many of them had owned for 2 decades or more, unquote, were, just to throw out a few names, Frank Sinatra, Doris Day, Audrey Hepburn, Rock Hudson, Burt Lancaster, Kirk Douglas, John Wayne, Charlton Heston, Henry Fonda, Gregory Peck, Elizabeth Taylor, Jerry Lewis, Dean Martin. Just to give you a sense of what was happening in the late 60s, that these stars and others like them were more or less told, don't let the door hit you on the way out, because audiences wanted stars that did not look or feel like the stars of old, within limits. In many cases, as my first book exhaustively detailed, white men remained privileged. But instead of the old types of white men, we got the method acting, scruffy or ethnic everyman, rough rebel types like Dustin Hoffman. Yet Latinos and Muslims continued to be largely effaced, and there were not major theatrical films about the disabled during this time, or not many, in this time that me and Kieron are discussing today, which is about 1970 to roughly 1973. Now, this is where I would normally transition. Now that I mentioned that you're not hearing much about Latinos or Muslims, I might normally transition to blaxploitation, but I want to complicate that transition more than most textbooks do, Kieron. You read about blaxploitation textbooks, you find out that they associate the civil rights movement with, the increased inclusion of Black people in front of and behind the camera. I think that's fair. That's right. Let's not say that one had nothing to do with the other. But if you're going to associate the civil rights movement with, the surge in Black film, all Black films and Black filmmaking, how is it possible that second wave feminism didn't have any kind of comparable effect for women? I mean, that just very few textbooks will go there. They'll mention one, they're not going to mention the other. See, it would sort of make sense that it's the civil rights movement. You see where I'm going with that? They don't bring that up, right?
Right. Yeah, it makes sense.
Right, but they should, because now, why do I say that? Well, I mean, of the all the female directors who've ever worked in Hollywood, only Elaine May made major films in the 70s consistently, and hers tended to centralize men. If anything, textbooks tell us of a backlash at this time of studios taking almost revenge against feminism, yet not against Black power. Now, Kieron, I don't have one magical reason for this discrepancy. It's more like a reminder that racism and sexism have different permutations. If I had to guess, I might say that to the new young white male business executives who took over the studios in the 1960s, think Robert Evans or Daryl Zanuck Jr. I think for some of these guys, women's stories had been told for 40 years by the likes of, Bette Davis, Katharine Hepburn, Ingrid Bergman, and while Black stories outside of the ones that could star Sidney Poitier had basically been left untold. So the audiences for those were more underserved, but that's just a guess. I don't really know why it's such a discrepancy. I just thought I would point it out because it's glaringly not pointed out in most books about this period. Or it's sort of weird because you say, oh, okay, civil rights movement, a bunch of Black movies. Why don't we hear, okay, feminism, bunch of feminist movies. Now, I'm not saying there were none, zero. I mean, you might make a case for a couple of Jane Fonda films. I'm just saying not much.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense.
Previous podcasts have done deep dives into the canonized films Guess Who's Coming to Dinner and In the Heat of the Night. But the journey from those films to today's films requires what I consider a little bit more explanation, Kieron. While those two Sidney Poitier vehicles were in theaters during 1967, viewers could also see To Sir with Love, starring Poitier as a schoolteacher in Britain, as well as, if they wanted to see this that year, Otto Preminger's Hurry Sundown, which Donald Bogle names as the, quote, first major big-budget, star-studded motion picture to center on the militant spirit of the mid-1960s and the Black Revolt, unquote. After the very untimely, mysterious death even of Dorothy Dandridge in 1965, it was almost as though her ex, Otto Preminger, made the movie he should have made starring her when she was alive. Hurry Sundown was not critically loved. It wasn't popular, Kieron. It wasn't all Black. It starred Michael Caine and Jane Fonda, but it was a great showcase for 4 or 5 great Black actors. And as Bogle wrote, quote, it presented archetypal scenes and characters that audiences associated with the South, with bigots, with liberals, and with touchy racial situations, succeeding on a primal level as a popularization of current events, unquote. And for Bogle, Hurry Sundown led the way to films like Cotton Comes to Harlem. That was his opinion, that was sort of the proto film of that. After his Annus Mirabilis of 1967, Sidney Poitier's next two films were 1968's For the Love of Ivy, a romantic comedy known for offering the first love scene of Black people in a broadly popular movie, and 1969's The Lost Man, where Poitier plays a Black revolutionary on the run after a heist, but falls in love with a helpful white woman. By 1969, that sort of Black gullibility to well-meaning white people was well out of vogue, partly thanks to Poitier's triumphs in 1967, along with the evolution of the zeitgeist. Now, look, despite what I just said, I can admit this part, Kieron. No one can discuss 1968 and 1969 in Black cinema without mentioning the context of the Black Panthers, the murders of Malcolm X in 1965 and Martin Luther King in 1968, Muhammad Ali refusing to go to Vietnam, H. Rat Brown saying violence was as natural as natural in America as apple pie, the dashikis at student protests, and let's say James Brown's, Say It Loud, I'm Black and I'm Proud, which was released in August 1968. Mm-hmm. In this context, recent films from Poitier and Sammy Davis Jr. look downright naive at best, Uncle Tomish at worst. You probably have some ideas. There's some things you want to do. Did I miss any big ones on the list right there? I was about to transition to Jim Brown.
Oh yeah, no,
Jim Brown.
Oh no, I think you've covered just about everything.
Right. Well, we're covering the highlights. There were some other meetings that it would have been fun to attend. In 1968, no single star epitomized the new Black power possibilities as much as Jim Brown, sometimes considered history's greatest NFL running back. Brown emerged as a star as the most entertaining actor in 1967's The Dirty Dozen. As Bogle writes, Brown, quote, was always a bold man, decisive, anxious for action, and completely confident of his own power, unquote. Bogle also wrote, and I'm not going to quote him throughout this podcast, but I'm just using him to set up. This is kind of the guy who founded like Black Film Scholarship.
Yep.
Wrote that, quote, by the end of the 1960s, the motion picture industry caught up, jumping on the bandwagon before it knew what was really happening, unquote. I thought that was a sort of a fascinating quote. Outside of Sidney Poitier and Jim Brown, 1969 brought these films: Uptight, Putney Swope, The Reavers, Slaves, directed by Salt of the Earth's Herbert Biberman, and The Learning Tree. All of these were impressive accomplishments for one reason or another, particularly the latter, set during Gordon Parks' childhood in the 1920s and filmed in his hometown, Fort Scott, Kansas. The Learning Tree, Kieron, might indeed have appeared on this C list, were its story a little more modern, more of a more like the Black films that were to come after it. For those, we go to Mr. Ossie Davis. Ossie Davis began in a time and region of routine race-based lynchings, rural Georgia in 1917, grew up there, excelled, attended Howard University, served in the medical corps, pursued acting, made his name by capably replacing Sidney Poitier on stage in A Raisin in the Sun, likewise followed Poitier in refusing to play Step It, Fetch It like roles, helped organize and MC the 1963 March on Washington, the one you know about, that everybody knows about. He gave a eulogy at the funeral of Malcolm X, and he worked his way up to major roles in 3 19th century set films released in 68 and 69, which were The Scalp Hunters, Sam Whiskey, and Slaves. In the 1971 movie Shaft, the title character walks under a movie marquee showing The Scalp Hunters, which is Gordon Parks' clever way of both saluting and going beyond that film, as Ossie Davis had arguably already done by then. Now, Ossie Davis knew that Gordon Parks had achieved something like the impossible when he talked Warner Brothers into adapting his semi-autobiographical novel and making Parks the very first Black man to direct a studio feature. All Ossie Davis had to do at that point was prove that lightning could strike twice, while expanding the proof of concept to modern times with the novelized crimes of Chester Himes, who had in 1965 published Cotton Comes to Harlem, which Davis and his friend Arnold Pearl pitched to several studios before Samuel Goldwyn Jr. finally arranged a deal with United Artists. Cotton Comes to Harlem was distinct from The Learning Tree in its modern Harlem cops and criminal setting, which would set the tone for Shaft and Superfly. And it was also distinct from The Learning Tree because it became a very big hit. Anyone who has seen Questlove's recent outstanding documentary, Summer of Soul, has a sense of New York City north of 110th Street in May and June of 1969, when Cotton, as well as a major studio, came to Harlem for what seemed like the first time. I mean, it wasn't. There had been other movies like The Pawnbroker, but it just seemed, it was like, wow. Ossie Davis got in touch with John Shabazz, brother of Malcolm's widow, Betty, and Shabazz helped organize what he called the Black Citizens Patrol to protect production from some of the neighborhood's less savory characters. The film's gold jacket-wearing street warriors thus exist somewhere on the boundary between life and art. Okay, that's my own, I mean, I felt like actually that was a lot about the pre-production. I was going to now discuss the plot. Anything that I forgot, Kieron?
I'm trying to think, but there's a few other things.
Yeah, go right ahead.
We did see that, of course, that meant that there were many local residents that were used as extras, of course, which you could see. Yeah. And of course, in particular, there's a few different protest scenes that we might want to talk about because of the contrast between, like, say, the residents that you see there. Yeah. But some sort of like almost I don't know, out of towners, you might say, that show up in the scene, right? So yeah, it's also unique for the debut of a lot of interesting actors as well, too, right? So there's Calvin Lockhart, who I always know as the original Biggie Smalls.
Yeah.
So, and then of course Cleavon Little.
Yes.
And I think Melba Moore is also in like the final like scene as one of the singers in the Apollo scene at the end.
Right. I wasn't sure which one she was. But
I wasn't sure either, but I think so. And I know that her and Cleavon Little were also appearing in Pearly, which was Ossie Davis's production of that was going on at the same time as well.
Yep, he pulled them off stage and put them in, more or less. Yeah,
right. And also Godfrey Cambridge had this particular, also very interesting film produced by the studio that also came out on the same day by a certain director whose other film we'll be covering momentarily as well.
Right, I was just going to get to that. Well, why don't we jump in there after but that's good. Yeah. Well, I'm glad you mentioned Melba Moore, Kieron, because I know you know that Cotton Comes to Harlem begins with prescient words written by Ossie Davis, but sung by Melba Moore. She sings, and it's, it's in voiceover. You don't see her during that 5 minutes, but you hear her voice singing "Ain't Now, but It's Gonna Be Black Enough for Me," unquote, which is later repeated by Uncle Bud in a sort of a telling moment. But anyway, she's singing that as a Rolls Royce rolls languorously through Harlem, trailed by a golden armored car. The Rolls stops and deposits young, handsome, sparkle-robed Reverend Deke O'Malley, who wades through a large, appreciative rally crowd, takes a stage and microphone, disrobes to reveal a handsome white suit, and speechifies that the black enough listeners will let him lead them home, like Noah, in an ark called Black Beauty that looks like a table of young women accepting donations. By the way, interrupt me at any moment, Kieron, if you want to sort of mention anything about anything that I'm, or you can wait till the end of the description, either one, it's fine. On the margins of the crowd, 5 gold uniformed Black Panther-esque peacekeepers confront 2 police detectives, Digger Jones and Coffin Ed Johnson, who throw one of them in the air and defuse the confrontation. Out of the back of a black van comes an attack from men wearing gas masks and orange hazmat suits, who open fire on the crowd, cause a panic, steal from the armored car, and drive away. Deke runs into the gold man's back door and directs its driver, who chases the armored car, even as both vans are followed by the green, was it a Pinto of Gravedigger and Johnson? I couldn't tell what kind of car.
It looks like that, yeah.
Yeah.
It was not what you associate with a common cop car or even a detective car these days.
No, well, then or now, I think.
I'm trying to think about streets of San Francisco specifically, or cars like that. They're much larger sort of tank cars.
Yeah. So Gravedigger and Johnson, they drive through many, many Harlem streets until these cops are finally foiled by falling into a watermelon truck. The black van loses a refrigerator-sized cotton bundle, and the gold van hits the overturned black van to end the chase with an enormous explosion. Digger and Johnson crash O'Malley's ritzy apartment. In a different way, they crash, but they find only Iris, who won't talk despite Ed throwing her into a wall. So they leave her with a white beat cop, Jarima, for when Deke returns. Is that how they pronounce his name, Jarima?
I think so. Yeah, it's an unusual name.
It was, especially for like a guy who looked like he did. But yeah, Uncle Bud asks an older woman for help hauling the random cotton bale into his carpet. She calls him an Uncle Tom and harumphs away. At the site of the explosion, Ed and Digger meet with 2 white detectives who salute O'Malley and slam Ed and Digger for being too loose with their fists and guns. Ed connects a corpse with a pusher whom they visit, but he's got no more than Swahili and bad Japanese moves. Deke visits the widow of his slain assistant, Mabel Hill, offers her money and resources, and succeeds in manipulating her into offering him her place. Iris gay shames and seduces Jarima, getting herself naked in bed, getting him to take his clothes off, and running into the hall where naked Jarima is humiliated by laughing neighbors. In a tenement, Ed and Digger find and rough up Lowboy, who saw the explosion. Barry Waterfield running, that's a name he says, and he also saw 2 men in orange hazmat suits running after them in what he calls a white way. Oh, okay. Apollo Theater headline performer Billy complains about her wardrobe, saying, quote, "Balloons, fans, feathers, I'm sick of them all. They're out of style and don't say a damn thing about my people. We got to set people's minds to think and get our own thing together," unquote. Iris says hello to Billy, picks up a new dress, goes to Mabel Hills, finds her kissing Deke, fights with Mabel, knocks her out, and gets knocked out by Deke, who hears knocking on the door and ducks out through the fire escape. Ed and Digger collar numbers runner Casper, who takes them to a Chinese restaurant where the 3 of them meet a mafia man who claims he never would have jeopardized his Harlem business over the $87,000 lifted from that gold van. Uncle Bud negotiates with junk dealer Goodman for $25 for the cotton bale, but begins a bit of baleful buyer's remorse when a slicker white man, Calhoun, comes to his ramshackle river residence requesting the cotton. At night, on the docks near Goodman's junk dealership, Digger and Ed bear witness to a shootout between Deke's militia and the orange hazmat dudes. They interfere and they watch as survivors of both teams manage to scramble away. As beat cops clean up the scene, Goodman tells Ed and Digger that Uncle Bud sold him the bale for $25, yet later returned to buy it back for 30. And they tell him they suspect 87,000 is hidden inside. Deke turns up and gets brought to a police station where Ed and Digger, supervised by white Detective Anderson, grill Deke about his so-called back to Africa swindle and the planned $87,000 switcheroo until a beat cop brings in Iris, who says she spilled everything, including Deke's beating of Mabel Hill. But Deke denies this and returns defiantly to his cell, as Ed recommends keeping him there as a message to his followers. Ed and Digger visit Bud's waterfront shack, where evidence suggests Bud was killed and dumped in the river when the cotton bale was taken. Black women dressed and marching as suffragettes are only the first of a crowd of hundreds to gather around the police station chanting, "Free Deke O'Malley," but Ed and Digger promise they'll get repaid, and they diffuse the crowd. They defuse and diffuse the crowd with firecrackers and chickens, including a Jarima-looking cowboy wearing a pink female insignia sticker, an apparent feminist false flagger whom Digger pie faces and then shoots the hat of. Excuse me. Captain Bryce brings in Ed and Digger, browbeats them, bumps them off the case, and releases Deke O'Malley, who quickly jumps into a car of apparent allies who promise the cotton and the $87K in cash. With a bit of Digger's help, incarcerated Iris impersonates an old disabled woman, threatens Jarima, escapes, removes her disguise, enters a church, twists the pulpit, activates a secret door, makes her way down a passage, and gets captured by Calhoun, who grills her and equally captive Deke about the money, revealing that both men are responsible for both the film's shootouts. Calhoun and his white stooges prepare to kill Deke, hear noises, go back up the passage, and firefight with Ed and Digger, who break into the passage to find Iris, but no Deke. That night at the Apollo, over a familiar cotton bale, Billy performs a spirited "When Cotton Came to Harlem, We Kicked Cotton's Ass" as a partial striptease until Calhoun appears backstage in coonish blackface and gets shoved on stage and de-blackfaced by Deke, who tells the fully packed, fully black audience that Calhoun stole $87,000. A crowd clusters upon Calhoun, yet gets decongested by Digger, who arrests Calhoun, binds him to a set of a plantation shack, sends him up to the rafters, and starts the next number, Gospelodians. Meanwhile, backstage, Deke fishes in the prop cotton until Ed stops him, beats him badly, and tells him, quote, "You steal money from white folks, that's your business, but when you steal from blacks, that's my business," unquote. Iris breaks in shooting and gets captured by Jarima and cuffed by Digger, who tells Jarima to find the money in the cotton bale and joins Ed chasing after Deke, who scrambles onto the stage, bleeding and disheveled, begging the people to think of him as a new Malcolm, even as the people bounce, while Digger literally brings down the curtain on Deke. Jarima finds the bale empty while Ed and Digger, alongside Casper at the Chinese restaurant, threaten the Mafia Don with black capitalism and black-owned businesses, unless he'll come up with, let's say $87,000. Back at the police station, Bryce and Anderson pull cash out of the cotton bale as Jarima protests that it was planted later by Ed and Digger, to whom he says, quote, "I don't know how you two black bastards did it, but you tricked me," unquote. Back in their car on the streets of Harlem, Ed reads to Digger a strangely live video picture postcard from Uncle Bud in tribal clothes next to tribe mates who tell them, Uncle Bud tells them not to further drag the river because he's living well in Africa, to which Digger laughs and laughs. Okay, Kieron, finally, you've heard me white-splain this long enough.
Same thing as well.
Thoughts about this film? Does it hold up?
Yes, it does. There are some odd sort of flourishes that we sort of didn't cover during the car chase and what led up to the car chase. There's something that happens that we're sort of expecting to happen in threes, but only happens twice. You know, there's the between Gravedigger and Coffin Ed and what looks to be kind of Black Pantherish people There's like a sort of like a lifting up of one of them, like throwing them up in the air, essentially, right?
That seems so weird to me. Yeah.
And then it happens again, essentially, when Lowboy's friend, who's also like stealing that church lady's purse, also gets hit by one of the cars, essentially, and also goes up in the air in the same way as well.
Yeah.
So it's a little odd, only because I was sort of expecting like a third payoff, maybe to have happened maybe somewhere within the car chase or some other sort of action set piece, right?
Yep.
I mean, I liked that, obviously, because it's, you know, it's just something that you don't see normally in like an action set piece, right?
Right.
Also, we sort of neglected, I think, to mention about Uncle Bud and who played him as well, right? I think we didn't mention that it was Red Fox, and I think
thank you for
his
bringing that
debut
up.
as well.
That's right, his film debut at the age of what, like 55 or something?
I think of that age, yeah.
I mean, it was, and honestly, if this movie had only, you know, bequeathed us the show Sanford and Son, it would have been worth it just for that.
Right. Yeah, exactly. I think that from what I've read, that might have influenced the future casting of him for that as well.
Sounds like it did, yeah.
Yeah. The one thing that I was wondering about, and I didn't get to read the novel. I haven't read any of the Coffin and Gravedigger novels by Himes. I've only read, what have I read? I've read Lonely Crusade, which I think is one of his earlier books.
Okay. Yeah.
The one thing I noticed different about the cast of characters in the novel was that instead of just a guy named Calhoun, he's actually a guy named Colonel Calhoun.
Oh, interesting. I didn't.
And he's like a wealthy Southern white man who has high connections. And while Deke has his Back to Africa movement, he also is going into Harlem trying to set up a Back to South movement.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
So
that would have been good.
It would have been interesting just to see that, because that is one of like the only things that's like a failing point to me, as I don't think Calhoun himself is that particularly interesting a villain. I mean, and technically he's not the true villain. You can see that Deke O'Malley is sort of technically considered the true sort of villain, right? You
don't get quite enough of Calhoun to think of him as like the master villain of this piece. He just doesn't.
Right, and he's not even really connected to the mafia in any way either.
Exactly.
Too, right? So.
Not.
But everyone else is. I mean, there's a very good rapport, which you always need a good rapport between two detectives, right?
Yeah.
I don't remember seeing Raymond St. Jacques in too much. He kind of integrated. He was kind of a big integrator himself. I think he was one of the first Black cast members to be in a Western on television. I think he was like in the last season of Rawhide, if I remember correctly.
You know, I wasn't going to mention this, but Donald Bogle just dumps on Raymond St. Jacques. Like
does he?
He's like, he mentions all these. I mean, this is a scholarly text that still gets used, you know, and it's That's like funny. Raymond St. Jacques ruined this movie, then he ruined this other movie. He's talking about all these 60s appearances of
that's funny. Okay.
Like, you know, so it's fun. I actually think he's fine in Cotton.
I think he's fine too.
I don't think he hurts it at all. I think he.
Yeah. I only remember him from a more recent film, the John Carpenter's They Live.
Right.
Very prominent in that too.
Yeah.
And Godfrey Cambridge, of course, we would be hesitate to like he's wonderful. Has like an interesting background too. He was also a stand-up comic as well as an actor, which is always an interesting balance too. You always are sort of, especially at that period in the history of stand-up comedy also too, just still relatively new also, as far as what we're sort of the beginning of what we now sort of determine to be modern stand-up comedy, or how it sort of came to pass, which is sort of in that point in the 60s. It also
feels like it's that big transition from the Bill Cosby to the Richard Pryor era. I mean, if you know what I'm saying, because like, and you know, Richard Pryor talked about how difficult it was for him. You know, he definitely wanted to be Cosby at first, and then he, you know,
more like a Dick Gregory era too. Also,
right? Thank you. Yeah. Yes, right. So there was, Nipsey Russell. I mean, I don't know.
Well, yeah, Nipsey, but Nipsey Russell / Red Fox. You know, a lot more strictly quote unquote urban audiences would see them, and it was relatively difficult for them to cross over into other white audiences.
I've never seen Godfrey Cambridge's stand-up. Have you?
I've only listened to some of his albums. That's about it.
Yeah, but that's great. No, but that's more than I've done. That's cool.
Yeah. I like him and such. I think I think there's some YouTube clips of him doing some stand-up on some sort of TV special. I'm trying to remember which one it was. Yeah. but he also had a very important role in another interesting
Well, I
Melvin
was gonna
Van Peebles
say,
movie.
yeah. Well, so you probably know, so right, the Kieron is talking everybody about the Watermelon Man, which came out the same weekend as Cotton Comes to Harlem, and it also starred Godfrey Cambridge. I mean, basically, he was the lead in both. It's funny because the Watermelon Man almost didn't star Cambridge. Columbia Pictures had wanted to cast someone white as the white character who wakes up and finds himself to be black, but after they
Yeah,
hired African-American Melvin Van Peebles to direct, Van Peebles pushed the idea of, yeah, let's hire a black person who starts in whiteface. And I think that was a great choice on Van Peebles' part right off the bat.
exactly.
I mean, I think the Watermelon Man, could have been on this C list. The issue is that it doesn't have a mostly black cast.
Right.
It isn't about modern cops and criminals in a way that Cotton Comes to Harlem is, and therefore, is more influential over the movement to come. And also another thing about Watermelon Man, it wasn't a big hit. All of those are in contrast to Cotton Comes to Harlem,
Yep.
which has a mostly black cast, was a hit, is about modern cops and criminals, and in that sense kind of minted, and it's directed obviously by a black man, so in a sense it minted a new formula that I think
I agree. Yeah.
Now, well, actually, I'm glad you agree, because I want to ask you this, because among scholars, Kieron, there's a sort of an argument over whether Cotton Comes to Harlem truly counts as the first blaxploitation film. I mean, to me, I feel like that depends on how you define blaxploitation. I mean, are the actors exploited any more than in other films? Is the
Right.
film, does the film assert a new black identity? Do black characters get revenge on whitey? I mean, you tell me, does a film need to answer those questions?
I think it depends on what I think it depends on whether you're pro or anti as well, because
Yes.
I think anti, one of the criticisms not only have to do with, say, like the particular broad characterizations of the people in a lot of the more famous blaxploitation movies, but also that a lot of them weren't directed, like going forward, weren't directed by black people as well.
Sure. Right.
So
Yeah, that's a good point too. Yes. So I guess it kind of depends on, right, because it does seem a little, the word exploit, that term, it feels more exploitative if a white director is telling a bunch of black people what to do. I mean, a little bit. I think it's certainly possible that a black person can exploit black people. I don't think that's out of the question.
right.
Yeah.
Well, also I think it's just the term exploitation film also, I mean, even though it had its roots sort of as far back as I would say the 30s for some of the films that you could like Reefer Madness, for example, right?
Yes.
I think because exploitation films had like a certain cachet and were starting to also fill a certain need in the second run markets and the drive-ins as well, because those other certain films that were sort of deemed blaxploitation later on also were making the same amount of money in those sort of venues as well. I think that might be why they sort of termed exploitation as well, just because of the subject matters that were expressed in those films as well. So
the recent Ava DuVernay produced, Simon Frederick directed Netflix documentary, They've Gotta Have Us, ignores Cotton Comes to Harlem and proceeds directly to Sweetback and Shaft. Well, I'm sorry, Kieron, but I'm personally calling that erasure. I will certainly have more to say about Sweetback and blaxploitation in a few minutes, but for now, I'm siding with those who consider Cotton Comes to Harlem to be foundational. Cotton Comes to Harlem.
I agree with that as well.
Thank you. I mean, I think it contains most of everything that blaxploitation films would go on to have. It was Shaft before Shaft, although I'll certainly concede that thanks to Isaac Hayes and Gordon Parks, Shaft has better music and grittier, rawer images of Harlem. Cotton Comes to Harlem offers this, it's a sort of an oddly cleaned up vision of Harlem, perhaps because Hollywood had so rarely been there, or perhaps because the film's DP, Gerald Hirschfeld, hadn't yet seen Midnight Cowboy, which came out a few days after Cotton's principal photography wrapped. Whatever it was, I think Parks had a sort of a more, I don't know, it's a more, the Shaft feels more like you're really in Harlem instead of like almost on a set, you know, even though they weren't filming Cotton Comes to Harlem on sets.
They were definitely filming it. I think there was also just not as much. I think the quote unquote grittiness you're looking for like happens only in a few places. Like say when they go look for Lowboy,
yeah,
like in that sort of section,
oh
right?
God,
So
it was like disgusting. Yeah, I mean,
yeah,
the walls just looked like like something terrible had happened to them. Yeah, go ahead.
yeah. So there are examples like that, but yeah, often there seem to be a lot more like setting shots. I mean, especially because there's, I think also because of just the act of what the two main characters are doing. They're detectives driving around in cars often too,
Yeah,
right? So I mean that is sort of the natural thing you're going to be seeing is sort of the scenery on the outside, essentially more,
sure.
right?
But
So it
it
has
just
that as
looks
well.
nicer. I mean, even in the big epic car chase scene, the little jokes like that guy grabbing the rack of coats away from the guy and him standing
Right.
on what. I mean, it just looks clean in a way that like the whole area looks nice in a way that, and I think that's partly because they just wanted it to look nice. I mean, or as nice as it could. Whereas I do think when they shot Shaft, they made it a little, I don't know how to say, grittier, a little more
Mm.
Midnight Cowboy-ish. You know, I'm not sure how you do that, but I think they just like, I don't know. I think the color contrasts are just a little less done. I think it's just, you know, they bunch the colors up a little more together in the frame. It's yeah.
It
Anyway,
could just been a film stock too, or just
yeah.
how it was shot
Well,
as
I
well too.
right. Well,
Yeah.
I think that yes, that's a choice. Yeah. So, what else about this movie have I forgotten, Kieran?
I think you've covered just about everything. I mean, I was expecting when Bud was selling his bale of cotton to Goodman, that Goodman was going to end up in a television set. That's just like a deep cut for a certain film that we
Oh,
saw
thank
back
you.
in the 80s.
Oh,
Do you
nice. That is
remember
a
the
deep
Amazon
cut.
Women on the Moon?
Yes. Wow. Amazon Women on the Moon. Now you're
Right.
talking.
So that same guy was the same guy who like
Oh,
ends up
wow.
in that television set, like sort of in the beginning, essentially.
By the way, did this movie create that Harry Potter aesthetic of like a photograph having like a little video component, like the first GIF of all time? I don't know, you know, like
Oh yeah, that was
I
a
mean,
GIF.
it was so
I was wondering that
strange.
you're talking about the end, right?
Just
Yeah.
yeah, I just mean the end because that was so weird, you know. But it works, right?
Yeah, I think it works well actually, and I was wondering about that as well too.
It
I
was so
couldn't think about whether
strange.
there's had a precedence or not.
You
So
weren't expecting it. It's a good time to stick in your avant-garde because you're 2 minutes from the credits. Nobody's leaving at that point.
yeah, exactly. And it's also probably a question of like there was a budgetary constraint too, also, right?
Sure.
I'm
Oh
guessing.
yeah.
So there's no way they were going to like try and really like do like an actual like scene,
Yes. Yes.
right?
Yes. Right.
So,
No, that's exactly right. Yeah, they weren't going to really go to Africa, I don't think. Yeah.
right.
Thank you.
Which is what Ozzie Davis did later, of course, with a few of his films that he
Thank
directed.
you. Oh, I'm glad you bring that up. See, now that's not a back to Africa swindle. That's the real thing.
Exactly.
Okay. Well, if you're saying that I've covered most of this, then I'm
Hmm.
going to mention that blaxploitation and the Hollywood Renaissance aren't often enough placed side by side, but they were contemporary movements who shared the same antecedents. Essentially, the failure of the studio system to produce more Ben-Hurs and Sounds of Musics in the second half of the 60s, as well as a desire to appeal to the young street marchers and the student rebels. I ought to know a little bit about this as I researched more than 100 books about this period for my thesis on my first book, Star Actors in the Hollywood Renaissance. I've intentionally saved one of these season's traditions for right now, namely the naming of the previously covered canonized films of this period, 1970 to 1973, and they are Patton, A Clockwork Orange, The French Connection, The Last Picture Show, Dirty Harry, The Godfather, Cabaret, American Graffiti, and The Exorcist. Now, Kieran, you may notice a certain maleness of these nine. The Exorcist shares, or I'm sorry, it stars two females only to mostly punish them in accordance with then norms. The others are very male oriented, with the exception of Cabaret, which actually holds up as exceptional in many ways. I mean, that's a great film, I think. These are a fine 9 films, but they are made by white guys and mostly about white cishet guys, though it's absolutely true that they wish to problematize white male behavior. Interestingly, none of these 9 films are of the period's genre that really came to, at this time in the early 70s, criticize white men, namely the Western, or in this period, the revisionist Western. So, Kieron, if we start this period in 1969, we can name more than a dozen films released during the Nixon administration that were meant to deconstruct ideas and ideologies of most American Westerns. I'll name 15 really quick. Once Upon a Time in the West, Easy Rider, Midnight Cowboy, The Wild Bunch, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, El Topo, McCabe and Mrs. Miller, Duck, You Sucker, Straw Dogs, The Culpeper Cattle Company, Buck and the Preacher, Jeremiah Johnson, High Plains Drifter, and Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid. Although these films absolutely did not treat their white lead heroes the way that, say, Rio Bravo treats John Wayne, none of these 15 films I just named really gave Native Americans that much screen time. The 2 Westerns of the period that paired anti-whiteness with more pro-indigenous representation were A Man Called Horse and Little Big Man, both from 1970. A Man Called Horse, about a white man captured by Sioux who converts to becoming a Sioux warrior, is a fine film and worth your time. Have you seen that movie, Kieron, by the way?
Long time ago. I just remember just the hooks. That's all I remember.
Richard Harris is great in that, actually.
Yeah, Richard Harris is great.
I know he really is impressive in that film. I didn't feel this list could feature 2 such similar films from the same year. You know, that just wouldn't have been appropriate. Right. Ultimately, the reason of those 2 I chose Little Big Man was it was made for more money. It made a lot more money. It earned the first Oscar nomination for an Indian chief. It centralizes an American, not a Brit like A Man Called Horse does. And it was directed by Arthur Penn after Bonnie and Clyde, so it generally seemed to make a kind of a larger cultural splash than A Man Called Horse. I confess, Kieron, that I was also influenced by the documentary Real Injun, in which an indigenous teacher shows Little Big Man to a class of Native students to show them one rare time when Hollywood seemed to speak for the first Americans. Thomas Berger's 1964 novel Little Big Man, which I did read, unlike Cotton Cup Starl, is best compared with Winston Groom's 1986 novel Forrest Gump, because most people are familiar with the film made from that later novel, and most people do not expect the quote unquote history of Forrest Gump to be strictly accurate or to reflect the actual life of any individual. Indeed, the real Little Big Man was a Native American leader that had nothing to do with General Custer. Custer did employ a Cheyenne scout named Curly, who may have betrayed him and became probably the last survivor of the Battle of Little Bighorn, but the novel's character of Jack Crabb is not based on him either. I know I just said I've read the book. I can tell you it's a very Forrest Gump-like, fanciful, picaresque, peripatetic alternate history that never really asks to be taken entirely seriously. And I actually would argue that one strength of the film Little Big Man is that it preserves that formal and thematic absurdism in many, many ways, quite unlike the relatively sincere film Forrest Gump. Okay, by early 1969, Bonnie and Clyde and The Graduate had clearly heralded the arrival of a new, invigorating, and profitable sort of motion picture. And so Arthur Penn and Dustin Hoffman, as the director of one of those 2 films and the unlikely star of the other, wanted to leverage all of that esteem into something special. And sure enough, Kieron, they did. In fact, at a budget of $15 million, Arthur Penn was no longer overseeing insurgent films, but instead making an absolute A picture, even helping to redefine what an A picture was. Filmed in sumptuous Panavision and Technicolor, mostly during summer 1969, mostly in Alberta, Canada, except for Act 3, which was filmed very close to the real Little Bighorn site. I would argue that Little Big Man's budget shows up on screen in ways large and small. The outstanding role of Old Lodgeskins was offered to Olivier and Brando, and only after they turned it down did production manage to find Chief Dan George, who had performed in Canada's Centennial in 1967 and had on that basis been hired for a Disney project. Little Big Man, Kieron, was this close to repeating the mistakes of Cheyenne Autumn and undermining its central message through casting. It's funny, even with Chief Dan George, the rest of the film's casting is what Old Lodgeskins might call Strange. Not least because a Chinese actress, Amy Eccles, plays Little Big Man's main Cheyenne wife. Pauline Kael claimed that Penn cast Asian actors as most of the victims of the Washita massacre to analogize analogize that scene to what America was then doing in Vietnam. And on one level, it's hard to argue with that logic. But considering, well, yeah, I mean, I don't know, so I did you notice that? Was that bothering you at all? Was that something that
I was only looking at that. I mean, I couldn't tell necessarily until after I read the credits, and even then, I can only deduce like which actors were Native American, which were not.
It's not.
It seemed like a more of a mix than there had been obviously in previous films that covered Native Americans before this one.
Yeah.
But it's progress, but not like the progress that you would like looking back on it.
No. Although I will give it this one piece of credit that I think it really does deserve. Considering how much was necessarily cut from the book, it's somewhat remarkable that Penn and his screenwriter Calder Willingham made room for a character that is absolutely not in the book, namely Little Horse, who is clearly coded as gay, and in fact played by the indigenous actor Robert Littlestar. The fact that Little Horse is accepted by his Cheyenne tribe, even as the white soldiers show no equivalent, is a rather progressive statement all on its own that I think more films should have heeded and didn't. So
right.
There is that. I'm not, let's not give Little Big Man credit for everything, but that was,
of course,
Can I jump into the plot now?
Let's see. The only thing production wise, I just have a couple of anecdotes.
Please, I love anecdotes.
So this is from Faye Dunaway's autobiography, Looking for Mr. Gatsby. She just had a brief mention about Little Big Ben. So this is her first time, I think possibly only time working with Dustin Hoffman, but they were actors in New York in the early 60s. She said, and I don't know if you mentioned that, but the production was delayed a week in Calgary when temperatures actually rose up and the snow melted. And there was talk that she heard that there was production was negotiating with a medicine man who said he could promise them a blanket of new snow for $100. I don't know if you ever heard that or not.
No,
in your research.
I couldn't confirm it. That's a crazy.
Yeah.
It's
yeah.
True. Yeah, go ahead.
So this is like a direct quote about Dustin's process. Dusty was always searching for a way to make each take fresh. He wanted to make the performance different and unique every time. Everyone develops their own way of getting that freshness, but his, I think, goes down as one of the most entertaining. He had grown up in Los Angeles and knew the local radio ads all by heart. Earl Shibes was his favorite, maybe because he had gone to high school with his son Al. Dusty would get just the right nasal sound and promise, as Earl had done for years, that I'll paint any car, any color for $29.95, guaranteed. $29.95. I don't remember $29.95 personally, but when the assistant director called rolling before Arthur said action, Dusty, to keep himself loose, would go into these ads, rattling off their corny hard sell spiels. You hear it on the printed takes, which I don't know if there's a way to corroborate that also. And then on action, you go from unabashed commercialism to high art, moving right into the heart of Jack Crabbe. It was an amazing thing to watch. Wow. So that was her experience there. So
well, that's really something.
Yeah. And also when I'm thinking of that particular voice, I mean, she wasn't obviously seeing, I'm just trying to picture, it was obviously when he was like a young Jack Crabbe, right?
Right.
When I was thinking of nasally and I'm thinking of Earl Shibe, I'm thinking of a certain age, right? But obviously she wouldn't have been watching those scenes essentially, right, when he was older. Right. So, and the only other thing was when Dustin Hoffman was talking a little bit about Little Big Man, essentially, he was mentioning that it was really hard for essentially getting on the horse, essentially. And once he got on the horse, he had to sort of stay on the horse, essentially.
That I did. Yes, go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah. And so given the amount of time and effort it took just to get me in the saddle, you can imagine that once I was up there, we had to shoot as many horseback scenes as we could. So I spent hours and sitting on this horse, staring at my watch, thinking, when is this going to be over? Back then, I bought myself a Rolex with a sweep seconds hand. It was beautiful. I used to love looking at it until the day one of the crew members told me there was a problem. I asked him if there was something wrong with the horse, and he replied, "It's not the horse, Mr. Hoffman. It's your watch. this is a Western and people didn't wear that kind of watch then. So after that, to my great disappointment, I had to leave it in my room. And, that was, he didn't have that to while the days when he was spent, on the horse essentially.
Oh, that's funny. I love it. Yeah, I do sort of remember that watch thing. Of course, I read this like more than 10 years ago when I was getting the book together, so I've forgotten a lot.
Oh, yeah, exactly.
Nice to revisit them. Let me jump in here if that's okay.
Okay.
Can I take us to the rest home?
Of course.
Little Big Man begins in that rest home where Jack Crabb introduces himself as the 121-year-old last white survivor of the Battle of Little Bighorn to a young skeptical historian. Flashing back to the Midwestern plains, we see the bloody, brutal aftermath of an Indian attack whose two survivors, 10-year-old Jack and his androgynous teenage sister Caroline, encounter a Cheyenne named Shadow That Comes in Sight, quite unlike the Pawnee who attacked their wagon train. Shadow puts the kids on horseback, takes them to his village, and introduces him to their chief, Old Lodgeskins, who shares a peace pipe with Caroline, who expects to be raped, but Crabb narrates, quote, "Poor Caroline never did have no luck with men," unquote, as Caroline escapes without her brother. Luck, right, okay. Old Crabb narrates that the human beings adopted him. As we see, the young boy learn to use a bow and arrow, to stalk game, to use mud to protect his skin from sunburn, and personally from Old Lodgeskins, to read both trails and the Cheyenne language. Out hunting, when a Pawnee man tries to kill younger bear, Crabb stops him, but loses a scuffle as the man about to kill Crabb or sees that he is white, sucks up, and gets distracted as Crabb kills him. In a night ceremony, we learn that younger bear owes Crabb a life and sees him as a lifelong enemy, while Old Lodgeskins, in reference to an old, small but brave dead Cheyenne, rechristens Crabb Little Big Man. At the aftermath of a battle, Crabb asks why anyone would kill women and children. And as the Cheyenne tribe prepares for battle, Crabb quotes his new namesake by noting, "It is a good day to die." And Old Lodgeskins replies his heart soars like a hawk. The human beings badly bungle the battle to the point of a beefy soldier isolating and slashing at Crabb until Crabb sputters, "God bless George Washington!" And, "Do I have to get it? Do I have to cut your throat to get it through your head? I'm a white man." Words that just popped out of his mouth, according to Old Crabb. Teenage Crabb gets handed to Reverend Silas Pendrake, who reviles Indian heathenism and hands this adolescent to his young wife, who bathes Crabb, sings "Bringing in the Sheaves," preaches the gospel, and advises him to avoid temptations of the flesh. Crabb narrates that he avoided Jezebels, was saved, and we see him singing hymns in church, being baptized in a river, and falling in love with Mrs. Pendrake spiritually. But when he catches Mrs. Pendrake having a lustful affair with a soda jerk, he narrates, "That was the end of my religion, period." Young Crabb takes up with Allardyce Merriweather, a traveling snake oil salesman who uses a fake crippled Jack to prove his potion's therapeutic properties, who loses part of himself to disgruntled customers, and who disabuses Jack of Old Lodgeskins' moral order in favor of agnosticism or promoting preposterous propositions. Yeah, that's correct. A peevish posse descends upon them, demands the contents of the potion that has left 7 persons half dead, opens the jug to find snakeheads, and tars and feathers Jack and Allardyce, the latter of whom says, "Life contains a particle of risk." The posse's leader, adult Caroline, realizes Jack is her brother, cleans him up by the next day, welcomes him to family life, and, by a river, teaches him how to use a gun by using snake-eyed concentration before he shoots. Crabb, you notice this, Kieron, dresses as a cartoonish cliche of a gunfighter known as the Soda Pop Kid, who intimidates most of a bar other than Wild Bill Hickok, whose half-cocked kill of a random man convinces Crabb to hang up his guns, causing Caroline to decamp, complaining, "Man." Crabb marries Swedish Olga, becomes a respectable storekeeper, that's his phrase, with a partner who turns out to swindle Jack and Olga, who bemoan their possessions being sold at auction as General George Armstrong Custer appears, advises the couple to go west, and assuages nervous Olga that Indians are nothing to fear, ... as the film smash cuts to Indians raiding Jack and Olga's stage, resulting in Olga being seized and Jack being left back bawling, "Olga!" After searching what he calls hundreds of square miles, Jack returns to the Cheyenne, who almost kill him until he names enough of their shared history for them to bring him back to Old Lodge Skins, who says his heart soars like a hawk, smokes to his return, and announces to the tribe that Little Big Man has returned. Little Big Man learns Little Horse has become a gender fluid himene, for which there ain't no English word, and Younger Bear has become a contrary, doing things absurdistly backwards. It didn't make sense. That's no actual Native American thing. Okay, in Old Lodge Skin's teepee, Little Big Man praises his white wife's skills and General Custer for helping free the black man, prompting Old Lodge Skins to reflect, quote, "A black man once became a human being," unquote. Crab returns to the white world to find his wife, but finds Custer and asks him for a job as a scout. But Custer labels and hires him as a mule skinner, a job that relocates Crab into a regiment of ruthless recruits who soon rampage into an Indian village, despite Crab trying to stop them and a white soldier reacting by shooting at him. In the bush across the river, Crab tussles with Shadow, his old pal, until that soldier shoots dead Shadow, saving Crab for hanging. But Crab finds an indigenous woman giving birth who turns out to be Shadow's daughter, Sunshine, whom he brings back to the tribe of Old Lodge Skins, who has been made blind and bereft of allies, causing Little Big Man to sputter, "Do you hate them? Do you hate the white man now?" You must be loving these imitations. I mean, who wouldn't be?
They are accurate.
Old Lodge Skid says human beings believe every single thing is alive, but the white men believe everything is dead, even their own people. Thank you for saying that, by the way. I've seen this movie so many times. When you write your book is partly about a movie. I mean, you really rewind the scenes a lot of times.
Of course.
Winter and the Cheyenne come to the Washita River, to Indian nations, forever ceded to Indians by Congress, where Sunshine, pregnant with Little Big Man's baby, asks him to accept her widowed sisters in their bed in the picture's peculiar apparition of polygamy. Younger Bear brags of his wife, who is Olga, full of fire and forgetting of Crab, so Little Big Man refuses to get closer to them and more politely turns down Little Horse when he asks Little Big Man to be his wife. As flutes and drums play, Gary Owen, Custer's 7th Cavalry, descends upon the Cheyenne camp, killing and maiming, and Little Big Man can only convince Old Lodge Skins to move by telling him the spirit says he's invisible, which he ... somehow is, as the two of them scramble to the river, from where Little Big Man watches as the men slaughter the residents of the village, including Sunshine and their infant son. Captured as a renegade, Crab code switches like crazy, recalling for Custer his mule skinner ways, yet later, sneaking into Custer's tent, Crab fails to summon the nerve to kill Custer, who calls him no Cheyenne brave, and releases him back to a frontier town because Crab's life isn't worth reversing a Custer decision. You know that, Kieron. On a rainy street, Wild Bill Hickok assists drunk Crab, cleans him up, asks him to give train ticket money to Lulu Kane, and gets shot and killed, which occurs 2 months before. I'm not going to get into the timeline.
We can talk about that.
Yeah. At a bordello, Lulu Kane turns out to be the former Mrs. Pendrake, who shamefully admits her current job, tries to seduce Crab, and gratefully receives Hickok's money. After rejecting a severed up Merriweather's latest business idea to track buffalo, Jack becomes a grizzled hermit who decides to climb a high rock and jump off. But then here's Gary Owen, sees Custer's distantly marching troops and decides, quote, "It was time to look the devil in the eye and send him to hell," unquote. Custer spares Crab's life because, as Custer privately tells a major, Crab's desire to save his Indian friends will make his words a reverse barometer. So, sure enough, after the major protests Custer's impetuousness, Custer demands Crab's advice. And when Crab tells him the truth, that advancing will mean doom, Custer insists on believing it to be a lie. In an epic battle, the gathered Cheyenne and Sioux surround and defeat Custer's cavalry, leaving Custer desperate, ranting, and ready to kill Crab. But at the last minute, Younger Bear kills Custer and later, in a familiar teepee, exults that he has paid off his life debt. That was not the right imitation. Old Lodge Skids tells the recovering Little Big Man that he is readying to die because the white man just keeps coming, saying, quote, "We won today. We won't win tomorrow. Makes me sad. A world without human beings has no center to it. That's not a good imitation either. Okay, up at the top of a mountain, as little big man watches, old Lodgeskins ululates, dances, calls it a good day to die, thanks the great spirit for his victories and defeats, asks that this son of his doesn't go crazy, lies down to die, feels rain instead, and says, well, sometimes the magic works, sometimes it doesn't. Little Big Man returns to the village with old Lodgeskins as we return to the frame story and Crab's frustration. Okay, Kieron, does this film hold up? What's interesting? What's most interesting about it for you?
The film holds up. It raises a lot of interesting points, especially if you read accounts, say, from the author about how he feels about the particular typical liberties that were taken.
Yeah, Berger doesn't love this film. I mean, yeah, you know, I always hear authors complain they never like their novelizations.
Yeah, and I can talk more about some other interesting things about Berger afterwards. But yes, it does raise a particular interesting point that one should maybe talk about, because this is definitely coming up, I feel like, more so at this point in our history, as far as how do you feel about a film that makes very explicit allegories to like current events that are going on, and does that essentially lessen the entertainment, or does that, you know, take away from the film itself? Do people feel like they're being lectured to?
Sure.
Or are there things like that? So
are you asking me what I think, in my opinion, or just in general?
It's a general question, but it's something that you can ask as well. You can answer as well. But it's something that I've been thinking about this year. Oddly enough, when I was watching the sequel, quote unquote, of Candyman.
Okay.
Oddly enough, it was.
Yeah, that's what brought it up for you. Yeah.
Yeah, that's what brought it up for me also, because I think other people have been talking about, not sort of like in a sense of like mixing chocolate with your peanut butter in a good way, but mixing your, basically what I think Adam McKay says of like, force feeding people their vegetables, when they're entertaining them, essentially, which I think is what he was saying when he made The Big Short, for example.
Okay.
Right. So I was thinking about that in particular, and that was a particular inflection point in history also, where certain events were very fresh in everyone's memory and everyone's collective unconscious or conscious, really, because of Vietnam was essentially like the real live war, essentially, also like live on television as well.
Yep.
And the things that are going on right now also have the sort of live feel to the events that have been going on right now as well, that are unique as well.
Sure.
And so it's always interesting for me to see how how quickly people want to comment on that, particularly in the medium of film, when the production and turnaround time for film is not as quick, say, as for something like maybe, well, actually, I don't know if television is any quicker also, but something is not as immediate as some other sort of forms of media as well, right?
So, yeah, I do think it's smart of movies and TV shows to incorporate current events. I mean, generally, obviously, it can be done ham-fistedly. It can be done, but I think as a rule, it's good. I mean, it's funny. Like, I think I was going to mention this later when I was going to ask, like, do all 5 of these movies have anything in common? Maybe I forgot to mention that in the beginning. One thing for me is that they technically all take place in the present if you consider Little Big Man narrating from the present. You know what I mean?
Yeah, exactly.
And I mean, that's kind of unusual. Usually when I do 5 of these movies, at least one of them is set, not in the present.
Right.
But I think there is something to be said about these movies all becoming hits and sort of, like it's the 70s, people want stories for whatever reason. These became hits partly because they were set at their time. And I do think that they all react to Vietnam in some ways. I mean, we often hear that Hollywood never really made a movie about, or not a proper movie about Vietnam until after it was over. And I think that criticism is actually true. I think it wasn't until, Coming Home, The Deer Hunter, and Apocalypse Now in 78.
Right. And a few other lesser known ones that are also important. Like Go Tell the Spartans.
Oh, yeah.
Poison Company C. Yeah.
So I think, well, I guess my point is, I think that's absolutely fair of people to say Hollywood, dragged their feet and didn't comment on Vietnam as soon or as often as it should have. But that said, all five of today's movies are totally like informed by Vietnam. Like they're unimaginable without Vietnam having happened, if that makes sense. Like
Right.
none of them would have been made the same way 10 years earlier. A lot of them are very violent, especially in the beginnings of the films. And it's sort of like, there's a way in which it's like, okay, well, kind of like what you just said, Kieron, like people are used to violence in their living rooms on TV. So we know you're used to that. Here's this, and in a way that just wouldn't have happened 10 years before, I think.
Right, and also Arthur Penn sort of ushered in to sort of with his film Bonnie and Clyde, sort of ushered in a particular type of violence as well.
Sure did. Yeah. No,
yeah.
They're all like and then the Wild Bunch said, like Sam Peckinpah literally said, I want to out Bonnie and Clyde, and that movie begins with this balletic, brutal battle, this first 10 minutes, and I think it's interesting to me because actually all five of these films, I mean, I'm kind of jumping my own gun, so to speak. Sorry to put guns in there, but like I mean, all five of these movies, there's something really violent happens in the first 10 minutes, whether it's, a shootout of a crowd in Harlem or like this aftermath of this battle in Little Big Man, like there's so much blood on that couch of that, it's almost like and then these movies and like what Coffy does to shoot a good person's head, and certainly what is kind of called child rape in in the movie we're about to get to. And then, I mean, the least of them is Bruce Lee's, what he's doing in the first 10 minutes, which all he's doing is creating mixed martial arts, which is awesome. But anyway, my point is that like all of them actually start with this extreme violence. And then in many ways, they actually slow down the violence after that. After Coffee shoots the guy in the head, it's never that extreme again, if that or not really. It's sort of like
until towards the end, I would say.
Yeah. But I guess what I'm saying is that's why I think these five movies might look a little strange to audiences 50 years later, because I feel like we're more used to a slower buildup. We're more used to like The Godfather, where it's like there's not as much violence in the beginning, and then it builds and builds and builds, and then it becomes orgiastic and horrible, So anyway, but I feel like these five movies were like, okay, we know that we know you watch Vietnam on the news every night. Here in our first 10 minutes, we're exceeding that. Now that we're all talking, here's what I really want to say. And in many cases, it wasn't all that. I mean, even I think with Little Big Man, just to finally bring it back to Little Big Man 20 minutes later, I mean, the big scene, the big climactic scene, the Battle of Little Bighorn, it's strangely not that bloody the way it's done. I mean, it's no Brave. It's no Lord of the Rings. You know what I mean?
It's accurate too. I was trying to remember if actually there were more rifles used from the Native American side as well.
Yeah, well, I don't know how close they got it. I mean, that earlier in the movie they're like guns. They didn't even use guns, and I'm like, yeah, they did.
Yeah, they did.
Yeah, but I'm just saying that like compared to that opening shot, which has Dustin Hoffman's name on the title card, which is really, I think, bloody and like putting in your face, like here's a guy covered in blood in a way that we haven't really began too many Westerns with, at least in America.
Sort of almost like bookending the ending of Bonnie and Clyde.
Yeah, it
is.
Their
bloody bodies.
That's exactly right. Yeah, there you go. It could be very much a reference. It could be like him picking up where he left off. He made Alice's Restaurant in between.
He did after that, yeah.
But I know what you mean. He could be kind of picking up where he left off. Yeah. What are some other good things about Little Big Man that I've forgotten?
Well, obviously the entire cast from top to bottom is very, very strong. I would classify Caroline as very much a tomboy rather than androgynous necessarily.
Well, but I think a tomboy is androgynous. But okay, sure.
You could say that, yeah. You could equivalent. Yeah, I would. Yeah, that would make sense. I wouldn't necessarily say like they're necessarily the female characters are the strongest, most liberated female characters. Maybe
No,
you could say
especially
here.
not Mrs. Pendrake. Oh,
Especially not, yeah,
it's very much of that time. It's very early 70s, this backlash or whatever it is. Yeah, go ahead. Uh-huh.
yeah, but they're all like performed. I mean, everyone is very, very excellent and should be like seen in more things. Like, Carolyn Crabb, she should be seen in more things. Kelly Jean Peters is Olga, should be seen in more things.
Yeah, she's good.
She's freaking great. Yeah, but everyone else, I mean, also, I just don't think of Richard Mulligan as like a movie star also as well.
Right. I mean, obviously it's a silly role. They kind of write it two-dimensionally the way he's supposed to play Custer, but it sort of works, in the context.
It works, and he's also kind of just he's silly, but he's also a sociopath as well.
Oh yeah, and that
so
that absolutely plays.
Yeah, that plays as well. So I'm just trying to think about if there's anything else. I mean, we sort of touched upon how the movie just sort of talks about basically Crab going through these different phases, which represents different archetypes that are in Westerns, right? So, and I think those are pretty strong. I'm trying to think if there are any other archetypes that were skipped that he didn't go through in his life as well. I feel like they covered pretty much just about every archetype.
They were trying to problematize, like, okay, here's the soda pop kid, which played like Yosemite Sam or something, and whatever. They tried to, there's the medicine man, the snake oil sale. I mean, it was like all these they were kind of ticking a lot of boxes, maybe too many boxes. But
exactly.
People love Forrest Gump, so there's no reason they shouldn't love Little Big Man for doing something somewhat similar.
Yeah, I would agree. I go back to this film more than I've ever gone back to Forrest Gump. So
yeah, obviously me too, but
but for different reasons. Yes, yeah.
Book, yeah.
Yeah.
What are some other things? Anything else? I mean, I have other things to say myself that might remind you of things
I'm just trying to think. I just have more things to say more about Berger, and I don't know if you. I know you had like the sequel they wrote many years later for Big Man also too, which I don't know if you actually read that or not.
Read it, but go ahead. Yes. You read it?
No, I did not read it. I was just thinking that because I think the Buffalo Bill gets touched on just a little bit in the movie, but I think goes into more detail in the book.
He's barely seen. It's like
he's barely seen at the end, right?
I think they even had to cast an actor. It's like a stunt double
because it looks like a stunt double, right?
Just like it's just enough. Actually, if they had meant to like make a sequel, you can kind of see how they could have played it, But yeah,
right. There were some interesting things going on. I don't know if you looked. There was a writer who did like a eulogy, like of William Berger, like in the Atlantic when he passed, and then about a month later, he sort of wrote in a different magazine, this sort of strange odyssey where he was corresponding with him back and forth for a little while for 15 years, and it seemed like William Berger may or may not intimating that Jack Crabbe was a real person in real life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. Right. Well, whatever is all I can say.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, I know. Whatever. But it was pretty interesting just to sort of see the things the mental gymnastics that the author went through as far as.
Next thing we're going to be told Forrest Gump is a real person. Okay, great.
Exactly. So, yeah, I mean, just very strong cast. It's one of those films where it does not drag in any spot in any way. I don't think so. There are certain parts that could be fleshed out even more. I always feel, but yeah, I've always enjoyed this film, so it's always good to sort of talk about it at length. And I didn't realize that you had covered it at such length as well, too. So,
but never on this podcast.
Yeah.
When this podcast discussed the 1950 film Broken Arrow, I mentioned how Daryl Zanuck hired Rosebud Yellow Robe to distinguish Broken Arrow from Pocahontas stereotypes, partly because Broken Arrow does not treat its lead Indian female as a princess, and partly because Broken Arrow is set more than 250 years later than the Pocahontas story. 20 years after that film, when Little Big Man came out, the press favored it with headlines like, quote, The good guys wear war paint. Dustin Hoffman and Arthur Penn turn Hollywood upside down, unquote. So in this case, instead of hiring Native American, Hoffman was hired to tell the press things like, I'm quoting now Hoffman talking to the press, when the whites won a battle, it was a victory. When the Indians won, it was called a massacre, unquote. Now, I have no problem with him saying that. I think he's right. But I still would argue that the Pocahontas problem lingers over both Broken Arrow and Little Big Man, and frankly, also A Man Called Horse, and all of the successors to those films, from Dances with Wolves to Ferngully to The New World to James Cameron's Avatar and its sequels. You know, one takeaway from all those problems is at some point, Kieron, what we could use is a big epic starring a Native American man and a white woman. that would problematize that whole thing a little, you know.
Of course.
At some other point, I think we would also need a film that tells the story of the Old West through an actual Native American lead. I don't think we've had. Let me ask you: has that happened here? Because you know more movies than I do. Now, I'm talking about a movie where, like, Old Lodgeskins is the lead of the movie. You know, like it's.
Right.
You know, I haven't seen that. I don't think it.
No, I'm trying to remember if Tom Laughlin, if he's one of those whites that has Native American blood or not, because you know he went through his Billy Jack phase.
Right, but Billy Jack is modern set.
Is modern set, yeah.
No, I mean like I shouldn't say kung fu, because that's not really what I mean. But you know what I mean? Like, well, so
was Squanto one? Was Squanto the one? Was that actor? I'm trying to remember if he was.
That's set in Pocahontas times.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember if the actor playing him is.
Now you're going back to the 17th century. I mean, that's way.
Yeah.
No. I mean, like, Old Lodgeskins is the lead. You know what I mean? Like that kind of thing. You know, or make it Crazy Horse, or make it Sitting Bull, or make it whoever, Chief Seattle. I don't know, somebody. You know, I don't. Maybe Geronimo, the movie with the one
with Wes Studi, right? Yeah.
But you know, I don't really think I'm remembering that movie. It's told from Jason Patric's perspective.
That's like many of these films. Yeah.
You know, he's not. I wish I could say he was, but he's really not the lead of the movie. You know, like it's always we're always told that we have to know it from the white perspective, basically.
Right.
I'm waiting for that to change, Kieron. Am I being too greedy? I'm sorry. I'm such a greedy person.
You know, it might take a while for us to like get back to going back in time to any sort of history without offending people about past history.
To me, is the opposite of offending people. Well, I mean, let's get Native Americans behind the camera. Let's get them in front of the camera. Okay, but anyway.
I mean, it's happening a little bit more, but it's more with contemporary stuff.
I know. Well, and we need that too. I don't want to, you know, one doesn't preclude the other, but yes.
Exactly.
I mean, because it's kind of obvious that in Little Big Man, Dustin Hoffman is our star. He is our rooting interest. He is the one who sends Custer to his doom, which in some ways lets the audience feel a certain unjustified innocence. I mean, I mentioned this in the book. I mean, you can complicate that, and I do also in the book by noting that there are at least a dozen scenes that prove that Little Big Man, the film, is kind of meant to be absurdist. It's not really meant to be taken that seriously in many ways. It's not just the soda pop kid. There's a bunch of, I mean, I guess I could say that Jack Crabbe repeatedly finds the world too crazy to live in, yet he lives to be 121 anyway, longer than any other person ever. So yeah.
Yeah, he's more of a survivor for the most part, rather than like someone who takes action, shall we say.
Right. No, I get that, but that does kind of suggest this kind of innocence the same way Forrest Gump does. I mean, and it also, the problem with the absurdism angle is that it doesn't quite absolve the film of white savior readings. I hate to say it, but I do think this is in some ways a white savior film. I mean, not exactly, not always, but in some crucial places, yes. In the book that I wrote, I talked about how Hoffman's wildly different acting choices, including different vocal registers and ranges of movement, result in, quote, here now I'm going to quote myself. I'll just plagiarize myself. The hell, why not? Quote, the film implies that things just happen and no one can explain them, which is absurdist at best, anti-progressive at worst, ... a sort of quixotic journey or a postmodern series of unconnected events, unquote, myself. Another thing that is not me, but I definitely feel like it needs to come up is that I have to mention this. The movie does mobilize noble savage stereotypes. Now, in case
Yep.
anybody's listening to this and wondering, wait, how could the word noble ever be bad? Well, then I refer you to Stephen LeBlanc and Catherine Register's book, Constant Battles, The Myth of the Peaceful Noble Savage, where the authors make the case that when Indians are only seen as these peaceful Luddites, modern Indians experience more discrimination for wanting things like plumbing and cars. And I do think it's a little problematic when you have, I mean, I know it's absurdist, but like we were just talking about with the guns, like that's not true, you know, and they had guns by then. So it's sort of like this. Now, granted, again, the movie is not supposed to be totally serious, but I still think that's a little bit of an issue.
So unrelated to, like, did someone did a Pawnee piss off Thomas Berger enough to like?
I know I wondered that myself. I wondered if he was, I mean, does Thomas Berger, is his daughter named Leslie Nope? Because other outside of Parks and Rec, I haven't heard Pawnee disparaged this often.
Exactly. Yeah, I thought that was unusual. So I hadn't thought about that particular tribe and hadn't looked to see if, in fact, the history as far as warring tribes was true between the Cheyenne and the Pawnee, if that was the case or not.
Well, I do. So putting a pin in everything I just said, I don't take any of it back. But that all said, I still see why Little Big Man is celebrated by at least some Native Americans, like those in the documentary Real Injun, because clearly the film means to indict the whites and fight for Native rights. In many ways, it takes the vaguely pro-Indian sentiments of the counterculture and turns them into something slightly more concrete, or at least, you know, it'll live on film, on celluloid forever. Anything else about Little Big Man before I begin my transition to the next thing?
I think we've covered just about everything, and if not, there will be more that we can talk about later, I'm sure.
Sure. Well, speaking of the counterculture, as I just did, nobody took the pro-ethnic sentiments of the counterculture more seriously than Mr. Melvin Van Peebles, who was born Melvin Peebles in Chicago in 1932, grew up working class, served in the Air Force for 3.5 years, worked as a cable car gripman in San Francisco, made very short films, brought them to Hollywood, failed to find work, moved to Europe, met various figures from Ralph Ellison to Lottie Eisner, pulled a Stroheim/Sternberg and put Van in his name, found jobs in Paris writing and short filmmaking, became friends with Chester Himes, just mentioned. Around the times Himes published Cotton Comes to Harlem, wrote plays, novels, songs, and stories in French, and finally made his first feature in France, The Story of a 3-Day Pass, which won an award at the San Francisco International Film Festival in 1968 and attracted Hollywood producers who thought that Van Peebles was a French auteur. Of the scripts that Columbia had in development at the time, now Melvin Van Peebles chose The Watermelon Man, which he tried to make into a Black Power film, but was curtailed apparently because the book's author maintained certain filmic rights. After The Watermelon Man made back its money in 1970, Columbia offered Van Peebles a 3-movie deal. So Melvin, this is what legend says, went into the Mojave Desert, thought, and decided to make a film, quote, about a brother getting the man's foot out of his ass, unquote. He later told the press he wanted, quote, a victorious film where N-words, he didn't say N-words, he used the actual word, but I'm just quoting him by saying it because that's what I do when I'm trying to be discreet, where N-words could walk out standing tall instead of avoiding each other's eyes, looking once again like they'd had it, unquote. By the way, did you notice? I don't think the N-word is in Cotton Comes to Harlem at all. Did you catch that, Kieron? That was sort of
it's not, but basically anytime the white cops say digger, I just think something else.
Your ears were going, wait, what did they just say?
Yeah, that's kind of how I felt through the whole film, essentially.
Yeah. No, you make a point, but I think I sense the over studio-ness of it, and maybe that's another good reason to get to this film.
Exactly.
So Van Peebles' eventual script, a personal story of a sexually prolific Black man on the run from police, failed to attract Columbia or any other studio. So Van Peebles tabled Columbia's offer, took the $100,000 he had left from his Watermelon Man director's salary, cajoled a $50,000 loan out of Bill Cosby, and made Sweetback's Baddasssss song, We often speak of someone like Steven Spielberg making a film, but few people have made a film the way that Melvin Van Peebles made Sweetback's Badass song. He wrote it, produced it, directed it, starred in it, edited it, and wrote much of the music along with an unknown group of guys calling themselves Earth, Wind, and Fire. His cameraman, Bob Maxwell, wound up his main partner. Maxwell didn't like using different kinds of lighting on the same shots, but when he saw the results, he was happy for the rest of the shoot. Van Peebles insisted on, quote, half of his crew to be third world people, unquote. My students, Kieron, they often flinch when I say words like that. They often don't know that in 1970, third world was a compliment that referred to whatever was outside the US, Europe, and Soviet spheres. Van Peebles knew about Cotton Comes to Harlem, of course, and hoped to make something messier, making a virtue of his shoestring budget. Nonetheless, it's not easy to make any kind of feature film on 1/100th the budget of Little Big Man, and stories from the 19-day shoot of Sweetback have passed into cinema legend. Probably the most famous one relates to the fact that Van Peebles couldn't afford stuntmen and did his own stunts, including in some sex scenes, leading to gonorrhea, leading to a workers' compensation claim to the Directors Guild for an on-the-job injury that resulted in more money for the film. Another person doing his own stunts was Melvin's son Mario, then 13, who plays young Sweetback having simulated intercourse with an adult in the scene that plays under the film's opening credits. This is rape, period. And we're going to discuss it more after after I summarize the plot. Anything else about the production, Kieron, that I needed to?
They must have to. A lot of it has to do with different stories involving the shooting of the film, especially like in. There's a lot of them, you know, like say involving actual members of the Hell's Angels, which were used, right? I think everything else you said as far as the actual filming, there are a lot of stories that that I wasn't sure were true or not as well. So we can probably sort of talk more about the actual film itself, because I just have questions about the film.
I have questions. I don't have answers. That's fine.
Yeah,
talk about them. Okay, well, why don't I just jump in? I mean, yeah, there's so many legends around this film. It's hard to separate fact from fiction sometimes.
right.
Sweetback's Badass song begins with black and white women watching a welted black child hungrily eating, cutting to a man running with a title card that evokes the Dark Ages by saying, quote, these lines are not a homage to brutality that the artist has invented, but a hymn from the mouth of reality, unquote. And later, quote, this film is dedicated to all the brothers and sisters who had enough of the man, unquote. A black woman calls this preteen boy into her bedroom, takes off her and his clothes, lays him on top of her, apparently initiates him into sex/child rape, and calls out, you've got a sweet back, as the title card pops onto the screen, followed by, starring the Black community. During the credits, the woman and bed remain the same as the boy literally becomes a man, to the applause of an audience who turns out to be watching intimate community theater of two women apparently reenacting the Sweetback sex scene. Backstage, two white cops ask the black stage manager for help while the audience applauds an effeminate male fairy godmother with sparklers encouraging the real Sweetback stripping and mounting this actress. Sweetback puts on black cowboy clothes, gets into the car of the two cops, watches as they bust and capture a black guy, rides with them to a dark oil drill platform area, watches them beat the black guy, and uses his broken cuffs to beat the two cops into unconsciousness. Through kaleidoscopic shots of the oil platform, night transitions to day, and leg silhouettes linger over shots as Sweetback runs through what feels like half of Los Angeles, and a half dozen cops break up Sweetback's safe house, including shirtless Beetle, who, in the next scene, greets Sweetback with smiles, reassurances, and advice to go out the back door, where Sweetback meets two white cops who discover his handcuff. One cop returns to his car, fends off black solicitors, tells the commissioner about the probable murder weapon and Sweetback's injury, and returns to the other cop with, quote, commissioner says, get the information out of the N-word before we get him down to the station, unquote. He didn't say N-word, you know what he said. And, quote, let's take him someplace we can really work on him, unquote. After they put him in their police car, locals randomly set the car afire, and in the jauntily edited chaos, Sweetback manages to escape. As cops uselessly torture and even deafen Beetle, Sweetback scrambles to a rundown church where an animal print adorned preacher interrupts his sermon to privately warn Sweetback he's, quote, as hot as little sister's twat, unquote. But when Sweetback says he'll hide at the farm, the preacher warns against it and gives him a, quote, black Ave Maria, unquote. I got to keep using a lot of quotation marks because I don't want Kieron anybody to think, hey, did he make that up? A couple of large black men pull Sweetback and his friend Moo into a car, say, quote, you're the guy that got my buddy in all this trouble, unquote, drive around double exposed with a neon Jesus save sign, and drop off Sweetback and Moo in the woods way outside of LA, saying, quote, buy yourself a Last Supper, you're dead, man, unquote. In the night, Sweetback awakens to a smokily lit motorcycle gang who bully Sweetback and push him to make an unpleasant choice until he finally says, effing, only he, okay, it rhymes with ducking, what he actually says. The biker gang lays down lots of leather coats for a lie-on of a redheaded nude woman who says, well, that's like weirdly echoed. As Sweetback has intercourse with her, the bikers cheer and jeer until Sweetback proves his prowess. Then they're like, whoa. Sweetback and Moo hide in an abandoned pool room until two white security guards enter and wave guns around, but Sweetback and Moo overpower and tie them. A black biker in a stripy helmet like Peter Fonda's in Easy Rider says he only has room for one and was told to pick up Sweetback, but Sweetback insists this biker take Moo because he's the future. In artistically avant-garde shots, Sweetback runs through the empty LA River and other parts of LA. The commissioner demands action on these cop killers and N-words. He doesn't say N-word, he says something else. But then he apologizes to his department's two black cops for his language and suggests they might turn this situation into a credit to their race. Oh, great. The search intensifies in extreme long shot / close-up pairings, vertiginous zooms and pans, dissonant music, assonant edits, brief on the street interviews, and much, much more until the cops finally arrest someone who turns out to be a white man in Sweetback's clothes. Under police questioning, this white guy admits Sweetback paid him $5 to switch clothes, asked him to run if pursued, and reminded him of a friend in Denver. Out amongst the yucca trees, Sweetback bleeds, writhes, listens to an off-screen chorus of black advisors, and then listens to an on-screen chorus of Latino advisors who point him onto a train. Eventually, cops locate a now headbanded Sweetback at a minor hippie music gathering. But when they find him mounting a woman, they laugh so hard that Sweetback gets away again. I don't know about you, Kieron. I thought that was confusing. Two cops fret that Sweetback will cross the border before they can catch him. They fight with each other, and they finally release their bloodhounds, whom we find after many unusual shots lying dead in a river. Jazz bangs hard. The camera shakes up to the hills as the title cards say, watch out. A badass N-word is coming back to collect some dues. They use a word. They don't say N-word. And credits roll. Okay, Kieron, you've been very patient through this long description. You know, part of me, it's like Sweetback. I'm like, what did I just see? But actually, I kind of love that. What's your feeling?
That's kind of I saw it a long time ago, like back when Xenon films was a thing, basically, and they were the ones that did DVDs of quote unquote most of the urban films, essentially, and the prints were not the greatest quality.
Sure.
Right, and I think in this case also, I have a Blu-ray now. I know there's like a recent set that just got released. I think Criterion did for Van Peebles' like first 4 films, I think, or at least 4 of his films.
I heard that, and I'd like to watch that. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, but I think the Blu-ray I have is ported over from to this Criterion thing, and they even mention essentially that there was just many issues with solar flares, for example, for some of the print as well, right?
Well,
so
those aren't intentional, because I assume they were.
I think some were intentional, but also there were issues as far as like how not everything was filmed 100% like on 35. Some was filmed in 16 millimeter. and some other things went on as far as which prints were available. Essentially, there's a whole sort of to do, especially when there's a film like this, when there are only certain prints that are available that are that can be salvaged, right? But especially when you add that.
Yeah, I thought they meant it, but go ahead. Yeah.
Well, yeah, you add that on top of all of the intentional things that that Melvin was doing to the film stock itself as well, while he was making the film in post as well. And there's just a lot that I don't necessarily understand if it was what sort of effects he was, whether there were emotions or whether there were actual subtext behind the different sort of things that he did to the film in certain parts. I felt like a lot of things were just sort of done because he had ideas that he had to get out, and he had this sort of film stock and had ideas that he just wanted to sort of put out there without necessarily worrying about putting them in a linear fashion necessarily, right?
Yeah, but that works because that's life. I mean, it shouldn't be linear. I think
I agree. I agree with that too. I mean, what I'm saying is that I'm actually fine with that also, but I think it's just something that you have to sort of get used to if you haven't seen these kind of films before. And I'm not as well versed on sort of avant-garde filmmakers as well necessarily.
That's right. Yes.
So that's what makes this unusual as far as how, in the terms of history, this being labeled a quote unquote blaxploitation film. The title, of course, blaxploitation didn't really become a part until like about a year later or so. Anyway.
Absolutely right.
Good right. Point. So there's that, and I think this film doesn't really follow the same formula. It doesn't follow any formula that you could see with the other films that are labeled blaxploitation in the future. What does sort of happen, especially upon a second viewing, is that you sort of start to hope or maybe like wish for a bit of trimming here and there for certain parts as well.
Okay, sure, yes.
There are certain things where I love the basically sample-like quality of the music that's going on. There are certain, because that particular refrain is something that is in a particular classic hip hop album that I love in particular.
Well, there you go.
I don't mind that. It's just one of those things where it just feels like there are certain points where it feels like he's done all the different sort of tricks to show that he's basically just been running this whole time.
Sure.
The other thing too, which I like also, as far as the sort of narrative of fleeing north normally for freedom is been inverted essentially, where he's fleeing south for freedom in this case, ironically enough, which I like as well.
Yeah, that's a good
there are certain other things. There are other certain like bits of rhythm that he uses with that basically the action that he uses rhythmically with the background. I'm thinking of the beating scene essentially with the Black Panther Ulier Mumu, where basically that's going on along with the rhythmic propulsion of the oil derricks in the background where it's taking place.
Right. Yeah.
Right. So there's that. That's pretty excellent as well. I think there have been criticisms about the actual like character, whether he's a particular sort of archetype or whether a particular negative archetype of a certain a Black character, and whether he has some sort of awakening or not. I think he actually does. Because of what happens when the motorcycle comes to him, essentially, and he lets Mumu go on the motorcycle, right?
Yeah.
But ironically enough, when the second time I watched it, I was wondering if that actually led them to their doom. Because, there's that scene where, what's the character's name?
Not Mumu, but somebody else.
Where Beetle, like after he's deaf, he goes to the morgue to try and identify the bodies and see if Sweetback's on there.
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure that's John Amos's body. That's
it is
on there right there. I'm pretty sure it looked like him, and I know the other one was Mumo, right? Was the other one who was killed, right? So you can tell by the I don't know if it's a kufi that he's wearing. That's right there. So So once I saw that, I realized also just by looking at but looking at it a second time, I'm pretty sure that was John Amos. So I don't know if that was intentional or not on his end, to see that even when he was doing the right thing, there's still, that it still led to, the police getting them anyway, right?
Right.
But also I think it has something larger to say as well about the sort of joylessness that he has of being Sweetback, essentially. Like
Yeah.
his what he's good at is effing, right? But he's not particularly, like, he doesn't really seem to enjoy it necessarily. It's just something that
No.
he's doing right there. So I
Yeah,
think
there's
that's
a zombified quality to him, which I think
exactly.
actually is intentional and a
I
little
think so too. Yeah.
yeah, it's well, because there were people who criticized his acting. I think that acting might have made sense in this case, because the whole point is that the black man is feeling trapped, in this kind of role, and just like, okay, well, I don't necessarily have a better idea, but right. I mean, like,
He's an everyman that everyone is, projecting
right.
their things, their stuff onto him, essentially, right? So
A more predictable movie, he would have just acted like Jim Brown acted in those late 60s. He would have just kicked ass. He would have just been Mr. like Lothario, like the Black Buck. But
yeah,
I think there's a weird, I don't think Mario Van Peebles wanted to tell that story. I think he was more wanted to tell like a kind of a look, he's trapped. He's not sure what he's going to do. He's not sure how he feels about all this. I think it works. I mean, at least for me.
right. It's also the interesting of his, I don't know, the story of, where he was raised and all that as well too, because it
Yeah,
made me think of Richard Pryor's story as well.
sure. Coming from Peoria, Illinois. Yeah,
Yeah,
and Gordon Parks growing up in Kansas or whatever.
exactly.
Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely.
yeah.
Well, I
So I
was.
mean,
Oh, go ahead. You go ahead.
oh yeah. So I mean, all of that aside, as far as, just any sort of trepidation you might think going into a film like this, where you're seeing something that's being labeled, after the fact as blaxploitation, and I think people maybe going into this film might have a set of notions as far as the tropes that have to be realized in order for this to be considered a true blaxploitation film. And regardless of whether this happens or not in this film, stands alone as, just a piece of art anyway, and that's something that should be taken seriously.
Totally agree with that. Whether we call it blaxploitation or not, who knows? Who cares? In some ways, I mean, I think.
Exactly.
Yeah, were black people exploited in the making of this? Well, yes, it was a very, very low budget film, so I'm sure that I doubt that craft services was always on time.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure there was some, if that counts as exploitation. And also, but I think the larger reason that it gets kind of tarred with that brush, or frankly, the larger reason that it's considered so foundational to the genre, is I think summarized by Donald Bogle. If I can go back to him, he wrote, quote, "With the glamorization of the ghetto, however, came also the elevation of the pimp slash outlaw slash rebel as folk hero. Van Peebles played up to this new sensibility, and his film was the first to glorify the pimp." Unquote. I do think, I mean, whether we don't necessarily see him as like a pimp the way that everybody's thinking about, like in Coffy.
Yeah, I didn't quite capture it that way. I didn't really see it
Right.
that way,
I do
but
think there was a certain kind of like not afraid to be a kind of criminal element that, like, I think was really bothering people when they were watching this movie, I think, to some degree, yeah, and it did. He also points out that the movie debases the black woman. It's true; she doesn't get to do very much. Although, I mean, for Bogle, but not everybody's going to agree with this. Throughout the movie, Sweetback was aided by members of the black community wherever he went, and surely at the conclusion, the community had contributed to the individual's triumph as much as the man himself. Unquote. I mean,
right.
I like to think that's right. With that chorus and everything that you're. Now, let me ask you this. So, Kieron, I'm going to give you two other perspectives, neither of which are Donald Bogle, and I'm going to ask you to choose between them. Okay, and you tell me who's right. Okay, So, door number one: Huey Newton devoting an entire issue of the Black Panther to this film. celebrated and welcomed it as, quote, the first revolutionary Black film made, ... presented to us by a Black man, unquote. Newton wrote that Sweetback, quote, presented the need for unity among all members and institutions within the community of victims, unquote, contending that this is evidenced by the opening credits, which states the film stars the Black community. Unquote, a collective protagonist engaged in various acts of community solidarity that aid Sweetback in escaping, I guess, which I know I just said. Huey Newton further argued that, quote, the film demonstrates the importance of unity and love between Black men and women, as demonstrated in the scene where the woman makes love to the young boy, but in fact baptizes him into his true manhood, unquote. Okay, that's one perspective. The other, now choose door number, or listen to door number 2. Tell me which one you like better. Now, this is from a fellow film professor that I'm not going to name right now for a good reason. He told me that his students went into open revolt during the first 10 minutes of this film. They accused this teacher of promoting child rape. He barely held on to his job, and now he certainly won't be screening this film again. So, Kieron, I guess I'm asking you, who's right, Huey Newton or current college students?
Huey Newton was probably right at the time, essentially, for what he was, and it's one of those things where different films basically register in different points in time for different reasons.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
So this is a particular point in time where this kind of subject matter is, let's just say, it just should not be celebrated, obviously, much less. And the question is, I think the larger question is whether what can be considered part of history and not sort of discussed in the present, and what can be sort of history, what can be sort of part of history and also be sort of brought back to the fold if for other reasons, that other qualities of the film that can be shown as well. Can people get past that scene, essentially? Because once getting past that scene is probably the most shocking part, right? Although I think there are some other shocking parts as well.
Remember me saying this is kind of my theme of the day, like the big violence happens in the first 10 minutes of each of these films. Once you get past it, you're sort of like things kind of settle down.
Yeah, exactly.
But yeah, again, trying to get the Vietnam savvy audiences, like, okay, here's something different. Okay, now I can tell you what I really wanted to show you. But yeah, I mean, it is disturbing. It really is disturbing. I mean, I get why this professor thinks it's like basically unscreenable, he's like, don't screen this. And, maybe he makes a point. I don't know that I would screen this full movie for my undergrads right now. I mean, I want to keep my job.
Yeah, exactly.
I can see why that would be even simulated. I mean, yes, it's probably mostly simulated, but it still is, what it is simulating.
What I've read, it was supposed to be simulated. I think Mario talks about it that way, if I remember correctly.
Yeah.
I don't know if
he's still alive. We can ask, should I call him right now and see what he's...
You could ask him, yeah. I feel like when I'm talking about Baddasssss or that movie, which I have not seen, I don't know if he talks about that scene in particular,
right,
in the film. I don't remember
that. See, that's the thing. I'm realizing that I saw the movie but totally misremembered it, or
so now I'm just trying to wonder if that's covered, or that's the one thing I did not in my research look to see, like what Mario's views were on that film as well, as far as making it.
Let me quote Stephen Higgins, curator at the Museum of Modern Art. He wrote, quote, not since Oscar Micheaux had an African-American filmmaker taken such complete control of the creative process, turning out a work so deeply connected to his own personal and cultural reality that he was not surprised when the white cultural establishment professed bewilderment. It depends less on its story of a super stud running from the police than it does on its disinterest in referencing white culture and its radically new understanding of how style and substance inform each other, unquote. I think that's a great point. I love what Spike Lee said. I'll quote Spike Lee, Sweetback's Badass song gave us all the answers we needed. This was an example of how to make a film, a real movie, distribute it yourself, and most important, get paid. Without Sweetback, who knows if there could have been, unquote. He named a bunch of his films. So I think that's an important quote, and because I mean, all my students seem to know who Spike Lee is, so it's important for us to say who Spike Lee thinks was Spike Lee before Spike Lee.
Yeah, I agree. Actually, he definitely was Spike Lee before Spike Lee in many ways. So,
but I think you're making such a good point. I think, Kieron, as far as like, I mean, and I agree, and I think Stephen Higgins kind of makes it too. I'm grateful for the near decade that fan people spent in France getting immersed in avant-garde techniques. I think the best quote I saw about that was from S. Toriano Berry, who writes that quote, he writes that the film's quote, odd camera angles, superimpositions, reverse key effects, box and matting effects, rack focus shots, extreme zooms, stop motion, and step printing, and an abundance of jittery handheld camera work all helped to express the paranoid nightmare that Sweetback's life had become, unquote. I think that's right. I mean, yeah, you know what, Kieron, I'll concede what you said, that like maybe he didn't need to do every single one of them, but it really is, as a whole, it's great. See, it's funny, you know, let me ask you this question, because I think for some of my students, when they see those kinds of mannerisms, well, I haven't tried to screen this film, but I have shown like a 2-minute clip or whatever. And I, you know, like just kind of when it's in the LA River running and people are like, Sweetback, I haven't seen him, you know, like I've shown that clip. And I think for my students, they'll be like, when was this made? And for them, that dates the movie basically. And for me, it's kind of, I have the opposite reaction. Instead of it feeling dated to me, all those flourishes give it a timelessness that I wish more movies from that period had. Where are you on that? Are you with my, I assume the way I'm
I think, yeah, I think that makes sense. I think also bringing the point about, you know, bringing all the different flourishes they did, I think maybe was under the guise of, well, this might be the last film I'm going to make, so I might as well put everything in that I want to put in, essentially. So
yeah, what an amazing expansion of vocabulary for Black film, period. I mean, that's what's so great, because where had we seen this? I mean, you know, you didn't see it in Slaves or The Scalp Hunters or the, you know, these other Hurry Sundown by Otto Preminger. You didn't have this grab bag of
no, and things like this happen sort of like later on. I mean,
but that's what this expands the palette. This gives everybody a whole new range of things to work with, you know. I think. Sorry. Well, what were you going to say? I feel like I interrupted.
No, I was basically agreeing with you on that. So.
Well, I want to also say one should not see blaxploitation as a movement started by 1 or 2 films. That would be wrong. However, because this C list is an introduction and not a catalog, as you've heard me say, and because everybody has to start somewhere, I personally believe, Kieron, that the first 2 blaxploitation films to watch are Cotton Comes to Harlem and Sweetback's Badass Song. Now, cases can be made that these 2 aren't even blaxploitation films. That's fine. They may not be exploitative. Isn't every film exploitative?
Right.
I do believe that Cotton Comes to Harlem and Sweetback provide most of the full range of what became known as blaxploitation, from studio sponsored to shoestring, from New York to Los Angeles, from polished to unpolished, from evolving the system to beating the system. And of course, like most of the best of them, they feature mostly Black casts directed by African Americans. Now, that's not true of every single one, but, you know, it's nice to have that. You know, I think that definitely helped the movement when it was happening. Anything else about Sweetback? While I was about to define the word blaxploitation, but, you know, I'm realizing that I'm transitioning now. Do you want to mention anything else about this badass song before I keep going?
No, I think I've said everything I have to say for now with this film.
Well, we're not, as you well know, we're not quite done with this era. And I'm sure that several listeners, like my students, are wondering, hey, where are you people getting this term blaxploitation from? Well, happy to answer that. Black leaders and preachers coined the term in the early 70s, and then they made it semi-official with something called the Committee Against Blaxploitation, formed in 1972, so that was a year after Sweetback became this juggernaut huge hit, right? Which I should have just mentioned. So Sweetback was an enormous hit, especially against its budget. People loved it. Okay, so a year later, after Shaft, there was this movie called Superfly, which didn't glorify a cop or a runaway person the way Sweetback did, but instead glorified a drug dealer. Junius Griffin, the head of the Hollywood branch of the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, stated, quote, "We must insist that our children are not exposed to a steady diet of so-called Black movies that glorify Black males as pimps, dope pushers, gangsters, and super males," unquote. So here was a Black man saying we need less Blaxploitation. So when we talk about where that term came from, it came from the people who were against the films, right? And then it was kind of seized by some. So, well, here's the thing, because they use that term, some people took it as a badge of honor. That's what always happens, right? I mean, we've seen that with other things, right? So in case you're sitting there going, but it doesn't make sense, Blaxploitation, well, now you know. In terms of better examples, this Committee Against Blaxploitation that formed in 1972 by Black leaders, that committee was able to point to 3 mostly Black films from 1972. And yet, Kieron, they were all period pieces, namely Sounder, about sharecroppers, Lady Sings the Blues, about Billie Holiday, and Buck and the Preacher, a revisionist Western that is the only one of these 3 that they could mention that was directed by a Black person, namely Sidney Poitier, who was an on-set replacement when that film's white director fell ill. Now, these 3 are fine films that might have been on a slightly larger version of this C list. Lady Sings the Blues is not available for streaming. God knows why. I can't.
Must be music rights. Must be the same thing as looking for Mr. Goodbar.
I know.
Yeah.
Buck and the Preacher did not do well in theaters, as I'm going to cover next podcast. Sounder is, in my opinion, an excellent empathetic film about Black people in the 1930s, directed by a white man. But there's another film that meets that exact description, and I ultimately couldn't justify having both Sounder and The Color Purple on this C list. So Sounder, go. If I have to choose one of those 2, I have to admit that the one that got 11 Oscar nominations and is directed by the most famous director of our times is probably a little bit of a bigger cultural deal. Okay. In 1972, as I was just saying here, and many Black filmmakers rejected the findings of the Committee Against Blaxploitation, not least because for the first time in Hollywood's half-century history, so many Black people were getting steady work. However, several Black filmmakers were willing to countenance the committee's contention that many of their modern set films' violent heroes were versions of an old Black buck stereotype, kind of that old Lothario, the kick-ass, kind of Jim Brown done as a cartoon. And so the race began to make the first modern Blaxploitation heroine. In summer 1973, Warner Brothers and American International Pictures released films with similar posters, but very different storylines. Warner Brothers' film, Cleopatra Jones, is quintessentially a Black female James Bond, with one-liners, tailored clothes, karate, a sports car with a secret gun, and a passport to travel the world. In AIP's film, Coffy, they may have named the character after Chester Grimes's Ed Coffin, but this Coffy is only a reluctant warrior thrust into the world of crime and grime because her sister has become addicted. Cleopatra Jones fights dealers as part of her secret agent lifestyle, but Coffy only picks up a gun to oppose drug-related crime, something that also plays as a reaction to the Committee Against Blaxploitation. It's almost like they were sort of agreeing, okay, we could also oppose drugs. Cleopatra Jones is basically PG rated, like a 007 film. Coffy is not X rated, but there's a lot more frontal nudity, as you may have noticed. Both films are worth your time, but having to choose just one for this C list, and I really felt like I could only choose one, I went with Coffy because it came out first, did better, and starred Pam Grier, who became more of an icon than Cleopatra Jones's Tamara Dobson. Because of Coffy, Pam Grier is now considered the first Black female action heroine to headline a film. I think that's right. I may be wrong about this next one, Kieron, so you correct me. Is Coffy also the first film in which the title character is a Black woman who is not at any point during the film asked to sing a song?
Ooh, good question.
I don't know that. It just feels like it must be. I feel like if a Black woman was leading a movie like a Carmen Jones prior to this, they're pretty much singing, including, Billie Holiday or whatever,
Well, this is around the time also, with the other previously popular films that came out earlier, where the soundtrack pretty much did all the singing for you also.
Sure. I'm just saying
that, as well.
like, I'm just saying one other thing about Coffy is nobody's telling her she has to sing, which is, its own kind of revolution for a Black woman on screen. That's all I mean, for a lead.
Right.
Screen,
but I'm thinking also in the 60s, there were a lot of different things where a lot of movies where there were nightclub scenes also, depending on the type of film, where there was like an actual like singing of the theme song or the name of the title, basically, right? So, and that was going on. And I think what may have, because of the certain soundtracks that started to take place with these particular films, they were more contemporary, right?
Yeah.
And the soundtracks reflected that also. And I think and there got to be a point also, I think especially with Curtis Mayfield's soundtrack, that was more of like an extra narrator, essentially, right?
I guess I just mean like, to even be a Black female star in a previous generation, you almost had to be like Lena Horne or Dorothy Dandridge. You had to prove, you had to sing, basically, sing for yourself.
Yeah, that is a good point.
I think. I mean, and Pam Grier was not required to do that, basically.
Right.
Pam Grier may be some kind of living proof of the virtues of interracial coupling. Pam Grier claims to be of Black, Latino, Chinese, Filipino, and Cheyenne heritage. God, I hope it's true. Grier was born in 1949 in North Carolina, moved around with her father's military postings, relocated to Los Angeles in 1967, got a job at the switchboard at American International Pictures, and was soon importuned into AIP's films by director Jack Hill. Cursory histories of the period often mention AIP in terms of providing the breeding ground for vital films like Easy Rider and Five Easy Pieces and The Last Picture Show. Less often, Kieron, do we hear about how AIP pioneered more minority-friendly trends like the Women in Prison film. In 3 such films released in 3 consecutive years, 1971, 72, and 73, The Big Dollhouse, The Big Birdcage, and Black Mama, White Mama, Pam Grier's roles got bigger, progressively bigger, even as her character broke out of prison earlier in her film's running time, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
By the time Jack Hill was ready for a full-on blaxploitation heroine, Pam Grier was more than ready to do the job. Now, as far as anecdotes allow, the month-long $500,000 shoot for Coffy was a lot more uneventful than the one for Sweetback. Listeners waiting for some kind of Latino representation in this podcast during this period may wearily note that Ruben Moreno, who played the important role of Shadow that comes in sight in Little Big Man, plays Captain Ruben Ramos in Coffy. Okay, anything else? So what I'm trying to get at is I didn't actually find much about this production. I mean, from my meager research, anything you found?
Nothing too much. I was trying to read different interviews from Jack Hill, at least. I looked initially with Pam Grier's autobiography. I was looking to see if there was anything specifically on that. She didn't have too much new to say about the actual shoot itself, about what went on.
Yeah, that's what I saw that too, or saw that there just wasn't much.
There wasn't that much.
Just a
Jack Hill did say for himself, he said it actually took 18 days to shoot, but the budget was $500,000.
Yeah, sweet level like compactness.
Yeah, and I think the story, corroborated or not, I'm not sure, was that they were trying. I think AIP originally was supposed to produce Cleopatra Jones, but then the deal fell through essentially. And so they were trying to basically fast track something else like that in order to get it released before Cleopatra Jones did.
Yep, and they did.
And they did, yeah. And I think I think Jack Hill said he wasn't necessarily keen on doing the film until he realized that there was a possibility of actually making the film star like a female action lead, essentially, because he knew that he was, he could work with Pam Grier essentially on this because of his time spent with her on those other 3 films they worked.
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, there are other things. Yeah, there are other things that are more about the film itself that we can sort of talk about after the plot.
Let's get to that then. Yeah, this is not the most complicated plot we've ever done, but we'll get there. This isn't like explaining to one a Space Odyssey or anything.
No, it is not.
Coffy begins in a strip club where a young man named Grover walks in, calls over drug dealer Sugarman, and tells him that he's got a strung out, desperate woman in his car, causing Sugarman to step out to the car, see Coffy lying languorously in his backseat, like what he sees, and command Grover to chauffeur them back to his place. Coffy begs for the dope, distracts Sugarman, pulls out a shotgun, blows a big hole in Sugarman's head, threatens Grover, says his dope got her 11-year-old sister addicted, and sticks a needle of his own dope in his leg. At a hospital, Coffy arrives late in nurses' scrubs, gets bounced from OR for shaking hands, meets an old cop friend, Carter, in the hallway, offers him jokes and coffee, and listens to Carter speculate that the crime scene she created was possibly a murder-suicide or maybe new mob violence. Carter insists on a date, so Coffy takes him to Juvenile Rehabilitation Center, as a big sign says, where she describes decimated drug addicts and brings Carter to her sister Lou Bell. On their drive back, when Coffy says anyone would want to kill the man who addicted her sister, Carter responds that he's only part of a long chain to a foreign farm. And Coffy answers she'd want to kill them too if no one will arrest them because cops are crooked, cueing Carter to cavil. In a private club, Black businessman Howard introduces a well-dressed Coffy to Deputy Commissioner Ruben Ramos, who tries what Howard disparages as Latin machismo charm on the liberated Coffy, only for Coffy to joke, not that liberated, let's hear what he has to say, unquote. Howard announces he's running for Congress, and he and Coffy return to his place and make love and talk about future vacation plans. Outside the hospital, Officer Carter chases off a white hoodlum who threatens Coffy in her car, then takes her to his modest apartment for a great cup of coffee and the revelation that his partner McHenry is on the take with a mafia don, Arturo Vitroni, working with one King George to control the black narcotics trade. 2 men in ski masks break into Carter's apartment, beat him badly with bats, fend off Coffy's counterattack, and leave Carter with what a doctor later calls severe brain damage. At the modest house of White Priscilla, whom Coffy met at the hospital after George cut her face, Coffy shakes Priscilla down for information, learning that Arturo and George are sexually kinky, and that George keeps drugs in a box under his fireplace before Priscilla's black female roommate shows up and browbeats battles Coffy out of the place. That was such a weird battle because it wasn't really a battle. She just kind of like pushed her enough to get her out. Accompanied by Curtis Mayfield-like music, the pimped out King George steps out of his luxury car, swaggers his way to a hotel pool, and sits down next to Coffy, who lounges in a bikini, puts on a fake and not very believable Jamaican accent, and claims to be the best at boffing. In a luxuriant apartment full of young, near-naked women, one of them answers the phone to send another out for a blowjob in an office, I'm quoting. And George arrives with Coffy, whom he introduces as Mystique, and takes to a more private room with the fireplace to check her out sexually. Later, the same apartment hosts a party that includes Arturo Vitroni, where the jealous Meg accidentally spills red drinks all over Coffy's white dress, giving Coffy an excuse to sneak into George's room and replace his fireplace box's smack with sugar, as well as an excuse for Coffy to start a bruising brawl with Meg and then half of George's ladies, arousing Arturo. Coffy privately sneaks a pistol into a stuffed lion in her purse, rides to Arturo's estate, enters, seduces him, feels him bend her hands back and call her the N and B word, pulls out the gun, claims she'll be pissing on his grave tomorrow, gets jumped by Arturo's henchman Omar, and falsely confesses that King George sent her on behalf of black people. Back at his flat, King George mollifies Meg, makes his way into his luxury car, and gets jumped by Omar and another goon, who wave pistols at him and his driver Studs, take them to a rural road, tie one end of a rope to George's neck/hands and the other to the car, and drag him along to his death as Omar gloats, quote, "This is the way we lynch N-words," unquote. As you might imagine, basically, Kieron, if I say the word N-word in this podcast, it means that another word was used on screen at the time,
I have seen that film, and I can verify that that's what happened.
Thank you. Howard communicates to campaign cameramen how white power leverages the Black community. Later arrives at Arturo's estate, amiably chats with Arturo, identifies the prisoner Coffy as just some broad IF, disclaims his own speeches because the only color he cares about is green, and recommends that Arturo kill Coffy. In his police car, Carter's corrupt partner McReady drives Coffy and goons under a freeway, but Coffy seduces Omar, brings him away from the cop car, stabs him in the neck, runs, gets pursuit, engineers the cop car's crash on explosion, boosts the cop's shotgun, sits at a bus stop, gets picked up by a naive white guy, tells him to pick up liquor for them, and steals his car. Back at the estate, Arturo tells Reuben and Howard, quote, "It does my heart good to see the various races getting together in the spirit of cooperation," unquote. I don't know how to do Alan Arbus's accent. I'm like, wait, this doesn't sound like the guy from MASH. But after Howard leaves, Coffy drives her car right into the house, gets out and blasts Reuben, chases Arturo to his pool, and shoots him dead in the name, she says, of her sister and Carter. Coffy goes to Howard's beachside house and trains a shotgun on him, but Howard claims he did it all for Black people, that he still loves her. And his words seem to impress her, ... until a naked white woman walks out of the bedroom asking for Howard, causing Coffy to blow Howard away and walk down the beach in the setting sun as credits roll. Okay, Kieron, thoughts about the film? What'd you think?
I enjoy this film a great deal. I just like Pam Grier and just anything she does in general.
Her personality really brings it up a notch, let's face it.
Yeah, and it's personality, her physicality, as far as, she's got the right physicality as far as like an action person, as well as a woman of action. Yes. As well.
Yep.
I think she was pretty good about doing most of her stunts, except for like a few of them from what I read.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, the plot itself is pretty straightforward. It's not like going to win any awards, but it has just a few like little different hints here and there of just sort of like what happens when somebody that's professing to do good for a particular community is actually not as sincere as they appear to be, and
sure.
that they're it's the mighty dollar rather than whatever community they're serving.
In Cotton Comes to Harlem too.
Definitely. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it parallels that film quite a bit, right?
Sure.
It has, it's not just. I mean, there are a lot of things that are jarring. We can talk about the violence being jarring, but to me, the most jarring thing is to hear Sidney Greenstreet tell Coffy to crawl on her hands and knees and do other things as well. It's just jarring to think about that as well. Yeah, exactly. But he and a bunch of other like interesting faces and interesting actors are always in these films as well. Yes. And I always appreciate them as well. It's always funny to see sort of Sid Haig play sort of like a token, I guess, quote unquote, you might call Arab as well, since I think he's of Armenian descent.
I know.
So
that is so
must
true.
have amused him as well.
But at least there is an Arab in the. I mean, well, if he is Arab, I mean, he's called Omar, so I'm assuming. But I mean, thank you. At least, well, there's so little Arabic representation in the first half of this C list so far. We'll take what we can get. I mean,
Yeah, and we can also see the representation or lack of representation of Asian characters, which happens as well. I mean, at least what I do appreciate with the Asian woman who's also handling the phone is that she is providing what I sort of know from the women I know who've like been like, say, in the phone sex industry, is that if when they say that they are white and blonde, they're not.
Yeah. Oh my God, that was a great moment. Yeah.
That was pretty. But there are the other like thing that happened that I noticed as well is that the other sort of Asian stereotype that you saw sort of essentially was in full effect, because there was basically one one Asian man that I saw, I think, played two different characters in this
Oh
film.
God, is that what happened? Oh my God.
So I'm pretty sure, like, because there was the when she's doing her fake patois,
Yeah. Oh yeah.
there's the waiter there.
Yeah. Yeah.
She was smart enough to only like do it for the one scene essentially, from what I could see. So
Yeah.
there's the waiter there who's doesn't say anything, of course, and then there's the scene where Howard is shooting the commercial essentially for his Senate run, his Congress run,
Yeah. That's right. And there's oh my God,
yeah,
the same guys in the
yeah,
is
that same there's that same
that's
guy that's in the
hilarious.
background as
Oh
well.
wow. Well, I like to think that's budget. I like to think they just didn't
It's a combination of budget, of
as
course.
opposed
Yeah,
to just racism and like
I was wondering if there were other people that I didn't see in extras before, but also you also see how some of the old, even within a blaxploitation film where there's the majority of like Black speaking roles, also you'll see different scenes where there still are like Black servants as well
sure.
going on as well, right? So there's still that element just to remind you of the times, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I just I just enjoy the film for what it is. It's just an action film with like an actual like woman who's like who holds her own as an action person, and is also like also she said she modeled the character after her mother as well too.
Right.
So which I don't think we talked about.
One thing I would say compared to Cleopatra Jones is like more than in that movie, Coffy has to be female. I mean, like, it's not a part written for a woman at all. I mean, like, whereas except for a couple moments in Cleopatra Jones, you almost could have a man playing that role. It's such a 007 role, which is cool. I mean, don't get me wrong, that movie needed to happen. But what I like about Coffy, she's coming at it from a female perspective, like all the time. She's always like, using her sexuality and that. I mean, she's I mean, I'm just saying that like there's more of it where she and honestly just her total doubting of herself, a lot of the time where she's like, God, wouldn't you do this? I mean, that feels, I hate to say it, but that at least, I mean, in America, that's a more female trait, to be like questioning the amount of violence as opposed to just normally assuming that you have the right to just shoot the hell out of anybody.
Yeah, I mean, you could say this is like a female vigilante film in a way, right?
Yeah,
you could say it that way.
But she questions it.
But she questions it, right?
But
she talks about whether she's in like in a dream, essentially.
Yes, but I like it. Yeah.
So yeah.
I dig that. Sorry, I know I keep.
Yeah, no, I think we're both agreeing, right? So yeah, I think that part is good. The soundtrack, I know it's hard to sort of like make comparisons to Curtis Mayfield because everyone compares everything to Curtis Mayfield's soundtrack, but Roy Ayers is no slouch. Also, he's done some great work as well. So
solid. I mean, you got to give Mayfield credit, but sure, yeah. No, you're right. That's a good point. I was just going to quote Pam Grier herself, and I think this might be from the book. I was looking for quotes from that book, like going through but I was only doing like Google Books, which doesn't have everything. She wrote, she said, the 1970s was a time of freedom and women saying that they needed empowerment. There was more empowerment and self-discovery than any other decade I remember. All across the country, a lot of women were Foxy Brown and Coffy. They were independent, fighting to save their families, not accepting rape or being victimized. This was going on all across the country. I just happened to do it on film. I don't think it took any great genius or great imagination. I just exemplified it, reflecting it to society, unquote. I like that. I think that's reasonable. I think this movie is a little underrated by, certainly by critics at the time. I like the use of coffee as a motif in the film and in marketing. They call her Coffy and she'll cream you. I mean, because, they keep coming back to that. I'm sort of reminded of something that Cheech Marin once said about the only way to sneak messages into entertainment. Cheech Marin said, the way to sneak in messages is like a taste-free additive to coffee. He'd say, you got to make it entertaining, but then like coffee, you slip in your little messages, And in some ways, I think Coffy kind of resonates with that definition of Cheech Marin's because it's built as entertainment. It's clearly just meant to be, kind of a romp, but it also does sneak in, I think, little messages about feminism, about being a woman of color. I mean, is it perfect film? No, I mean, it's not that. But considering its unequivocal milestone status for women of color, it's pretty impressive because it could have just been a much worse film that just happened to be the first female black action heroine, you know.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, that's also a good thing as well that this particular film was first for that reason.
Absolutely. Well, and nothing, you know what, Cleopatra Jones, people should see that also. It
Oh
just
yeah, very
that's
much so.
the 007, which is fine. That's totally fine to do that. I think let's also have that, you know.
And just to see Shelley Winters just always chew scenery like she does. So
when has that ever been in anything? Never.
I mean, Night of the Hunter a little bit, but
No, the perfect. Considering what happens halfway through that, you know, it all worked. Jack Hill prepared a sequel to this film, but just before the cameras began to roll, AIP decided that sequels didn't do as well. I was trying to research, Kieron, if it was also possible that AIP wanted a character who began the movie with ironed, non-afro hair. So in other words, when they changed it to Foxy Brown, when they moved the plot around, I got the feeling like AIP might have said, but can we also get like a, you know, basically a wig on Pam Grier so that, you know, she doesn't have like traditional black, well, you know, she doesn't have an afro anymore.
right.
And I kind of felt like, I felt like there was more than one, but I was looking for that in Greer's book and I couldn't find anything about it. But anyway, the sequel, or it was, you know, not a sequel, but 1974's Foxy Brown, that's also a good film.
It is, yeah.
I don't have as many good things to say about Friday Foster and Sheba Baby. I was watching while I was preparing for this. Besides the NAACP, another reason for the fizzling of blaxploitation was that there were only so many plots to do involving drugs, crime, pimps, and urban corruption. If you were going to make every movie about those things, you know. Here's the thing that I think is really important that I think we miss. There were other strong Black films of the 70s. There were other strong, mostly Black cast films of the 70s. If you want to look into some, I think a great place to start is those directed by Sidney Poitier and separately those featuring Richard Pryor. Richard Pryor's career of like, he has at least 10 fascinating, almost great films in the 70s. I think you go through, you know, from Lady Sings the Blues to Car Wash to, you know, you're going to see a bunch of great, you know, a bunch of really interesting films, I think, you know, to, what was the one, Blue Collar? I mean, you know, I'm just saying.
Yeah, Blue Collar is great.
Follow Richard Pryor's career. This is what I'm telling you.
Which Way Is Up is another one as well.
Yeah, oh, that's the one where he plays multiple roles. Yeah.
That's the one based off of Seven Beauties, I think.
Right. No, I'm telling you, follow his career. If you want to know really strong 70s films, that's a great place to start. If you go back to 1965 and 1966 and look at the literally dozens of James Bond spoofs and imitators and descendants, it's a little embarrassing how white male they all are. It took until 1973 for Hollywood to extend the type to Black women in Cleopatra Jones and to Asian American men in Enter the Dragon. I hesitated, Kieron, to include Enter the Dragon on this list, which is supposed to be dedicated to American films. However, the term American has already proved fungible on my list in the case of films like The Sheik, The Bride of Frankenstein, and The King and I. One criteria is financing. Another is an apparently Anglo-American lead. Unlike Bruce Lee's other Hong Kong films of the 1970s, Warner Brothers did finance Enter the Dragon, and somewhat strangely, almost the entire cast is American. Han's voice is dubbed by Chinese American number one son, as he was often known, Key Luke. The 5 other actors with the most screen time are all American, including the lead, who was born in San Francisco in 1940 in both the year and the hour of the dragon. If you are listening to this podcast without having seen any film starring history's greatest Asian American star, you should probably start with Enter the Dragon. Soon after Mr. Bruce Lee's birth in San Francisco's Chinatown, his parents returned to Hong Kong, probably because his father, Li Hui-chuen, a Cantonese opera singer, did not find enough work in California. In Hong Kong in the 40s, Lee not only sang in operas, but worked in films, often bringing his boy Bruce with him. By the time he was 18, Bruce Lee had played in more than 18 Cantonese films. However, Bruce Lee was a bad student and worse, malcontent, who got into so many adolescent fights that his parents felt he needed to be trained in martial arts. This was a problem, Kieran, because Bruce's mother, Grace Ho, had a Chinese father and a white mother, and Chinese martial arts schools and their students considered a one-fourth white student to be unacceptably foreign. However, Lee's friend William Cheung vouched for him, and Lee learned Wing Chun Kung Fu under Yip Man right up until 1958, when students of a rival school challenged Wing Chun, and because he was part of it, Bruce Lee, and Bruce Lee injured a student so badly that the police were notified. So, in April 1959, with Lee still not having completed his high school education, his parents decided to send him to the United States, where a family connection got him settled in Seattle. In my dreams, Kieran, Bruce Lee, and Jimi Hendrix, born on November 27th, exactly 2 years apart, share the same birthday, somehow met each other in Seattle as young adults, learning from but exceeding their white Seattle friends during this period before May 1961, when Hendrix shipped off to the Army. But I'm afraid there's no evidence for that. I would pay to see that One Night in Miami like movie, but it doesn't. It probably never happened.
Okay.
In real life, Lee finished high school, majored in drama at University of Washington, began teaching Kung Fu, perhaps became involved in another altercation that was reported to police, and dropped out of UW to move to Oakland, California with a friend in early 1964, where Kieran is coming to us from right now. In Oakland's Chinatown, Lee once again faced Chinese discrimination for advocating teaching martial arts to non-Chinese, but he overcame this by challenging and defeating some local Sifu, which is the Chinese word for masters. One such Sifu and friend entered Lee in the 1964 Long Beach International Karate Championships, where Lee impressed judges, he impressed contestant Chuck Norris, and he impressed a movie producer with, among Lee's specialties, two-finger push-ups, the sidekick, and his later famous one-inch punch. You might want to Google that. I'm not going to explain what the one-inch punch is right now. This explanation of Bruce Lee's life is already too long. After the 007 derivative I Spy broke TV's color line, Lee was cast as Kato on another actioner, The Green Hornet, but the show was canceled after a season. With the unanticipated extra time in 1967, Lee created Jeet Kune Do, as you do, what Lee called the style of no style, less like how he had been trained and more ready for street fighting, incorporating both Northern Chinese kicks and Southern Chinese close fighting, with an emphasis on, quote, this is from Bruce Lee, practicality, flexibility, speed, and efficiency, unquote. Over the next 4 years, while teaching his ecumenical techniques to students in LA, ranging from Anthony Quinn to Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, Lee also landed many minor acting roles, leading up to meetings for a TV show starring a martial artist during the Old West, that finally a network decided to make as Kung Fu and star white David Carradine in Yellowface. Oh, yay, great choice. In 1971, partly at the prompting of producer Fred Weintraub, a frustrated Lee flew to Hong Kong, where he was surprised to be recognized as the star of what was known there as the Kato Show, and he soon negotiated lead roles in martial arts films. His first 3 leading role films, The Big Boss, Fist of Fury, and Way of the Dragon, made increasingly more money in Hong Kong and abroad, including in the United States, with Professor Fred Weintraub finally attracting the notice of a studio, in this case, Warner Brothers. Screenwriter Michael Allen was charged with writing a 007-ish script about Lee. I'll have to say naming the character Lee probably saved time, Kieran. Being Brit recruited to check out an evildoer on his own island, only this evil man would be running a martial arts tournament. For maximum crossover appeal, Weintraub cast Black Rockney Tarkington and White John Saxon, who were both proficient in martial arts, but Saxon had a black belt and insisted on playing the American contestant who lived till the end, so Allen switched the Roper and Williams roles. When Tarkington heard about this switch a week before flying to Hong Kong, he dropped out of the movie, putting Weintraub in a panicky scramble to the first black dojo he could find, which was in Crenshaw, where he met Jim Kelly, who entirely impressed everyone he met. I mean, that guy's got movie star charisma to burn. Kelly, so it's crazy that they didn't know that until, running to Crenshaw a week before they had to leave Hong Kong. Kelly would enter his film career with Enter the Dragon and move on to movies as the leading hybridizer of martial arts with what was called blaxploitation. Warner Brothers had seen trends come and go in little more than a year, from spy comedies to spaghetti westerns. So the studio didn't want to risk waiting on its first martial arts film, going so far as to interrupt production on Lee's fourth leading role film so that WB could pay Lee to star in Enter the Dragon. Not willing to spare an A-list director, Warner's and Weintraub sent Robert Klaus, who had directed Lee on TV, to manage the $800,000 six-week shoot in Hong Kong from February to April 1973. No dialogue was filmed on set. It was all dubbed later, including Key Luke dubbing Han's voice for English-speaking markets, as I said. I want to give a shout out to Argentinian composer Lalo Schifrin for jazz, funk, the music of China, and other styles into a hybridized mix that I'm really not sure had been in a movie until this. I don't know that you had that, that Curtis Mayfield funk with China, with I mean, you tell me. I don't know where that had been outside of this, prior to this. So go ahead.
That seems pretty unique to it. And also, Lalo Schifrin has just done a ton of amazing scores, especially in this decade.
Oh, so, I agree, but I'm just saying I feel like he broke a mold here.
He definitely did. Yes, I agree.
Yes. That's my pre. That's a long pre.
So I have more stuff as well.
Please.
So I looked a little bit at Michael Polly's biography about Bruce Lee.
Go right ahead.
In 71, around that same time that Bruce is having issues regarding Kung Fu and the like, Fred Weintraub saw this treatment that later became a script that he submitted to Warner Brothers. It was based on the Mandan tribe in North Dakota that apparently people there were known to have blue eyes and sometimes also like Chinese features as well. And he made this script was called Kelsey, and Kelsey was basically the title of the character. It was basically set in 1792 about a trapper named Kelsey who's searching for a hidden path through the Dakota territories that runs through the lands of the Mandans. He's betrayed by a rival named Rousseau, and he's left for dead. He stumbles back to the trading post. He recruits an old military buddy named Woody, and then a Chinese mercenary named Lee to track down Rousseau.
It just saves time to name him Lee, Kieron.
Exactly, it does. So in Act 2, they discover the Mandans. They fight several ritualized challenge matches with their braves. They bed down for the winter with several of their blue-eyed squaws. In Act 3, Kelsey, Woody, and Lee battle it out against Rousseau and his outlaws. And in the final countercultural twist, the three heroes refuse to return to their trading post and choose to live with the Mandans instead. This was basically like a formula that seemed to sort of predate what ended up happening with Enter to the Dragon, where in this case, this script also has basically the same type of trio essentially, where there's the white, in this case the white hero, his black army buddy, again the same thing happens in Enter the Dragon, and then this mercenary in this case from China. And of course, what was different also in 71 was that Fred Weintraub was also not thinking so much that Lee could carry a film. So in this case, the script was just a little bit of Lee, and Kelsey, the white guy, was of course the hero.
More like an extended Green Hornet episode. But
yeah, kind of like that. Yeah, only set like further in the past. But yeah.
Well, right. So 200 years earlier. Right. Sure.
Right. And I think this production also might have been the first co-production with Hong Kong.
It was. Ever. Do you mean
ever?
Hollywood
Right.
First,
Hollywood and Hong Kong.
Right. I think yes. Isn't that crazy?
There was a lot of controversy, of course, that Bruce had about that script from Michael Allen. Most of all had to do with the actual sort of James Bond part of the plot.
Sure.
Because of the fact that James Bond might seem like a cool person in the US, but in Hong Kong he's seen as like basically an imperialist shill essentially. And to like make Lee's character like say an agent like working for England essentially would make him like the policemen in Hong Kong who were like following orders for Britain.
Sure.
So he kind of did not want that to happen. So there was a whole long thing that went on.
Did they change it? Did they change the script because of that?
Well, yeah, because remember he's basically being recruited now out of a Shaolin temple.
Yeah.
Right. So he's not an agent anymore, essentially, in this case. So that was his workaround, and the workaround was that they agreed to let Bruce essentially film that opening scene, essentially. the one with Sammo Hung.
Yeah.
So that was filmed, and also they agreed after that to sort of like give him more of a motivation of avenging his. Well, I guess we can
Sister.
sort of talk about his sister's
Yeah,
death essentially.
okay. Well, that workaround worked for me. Yeah.
Yeah, same here. So we can sort of talk about what happened in the production also about Michael Allen being fired and not being
Right.
aware that he was being fired also as
Yeah.
well. So there's a whole lot of backstory about that.
Well, right. I mean, screenwriters are so used to that. I mean, they're lucky if they even
Well,
get
he was paid with a trip to Hong
Hong
Kong
Kong. Right.
essentially.
Yes.
So
I mean, can you
some
believe? Yeah. With considering the influence of this film, it's amazing how low budget or how they were trying to cut corners.
right. Well, there's a whole thing of like half of it has to go to get financed by Golden Harvest Films, right?
Yes. Right.
So there was that issue as well too, and there was a lot of goings on, but back and forth between trying to
Right,
get
because
British
Golden
out.
Harvest, I was reading that they didn't, because modern martial arts films didn't make money. Wuxia films did. So it's like
Right.
if they were gonna put Bruce Lee in the past, sure, but that Warner Brothers didn't want to make that movie. They didn't want
Because
to.
Warner Brothers didn't like that make that movie, and then also I think it was with Chinese Connection or his first film where they saw that there was a possibility. I think also,
Right.
and then
Yeah.
so yeah, we can go ahead with the plot.
Enter the Dragon begins in a forest with dozens of cross-legged, berobed monks observing a one-on-one proto-MMA contest that Lee wins. A British intelligence broker named Braithwaite recruits Lee, brings him into Hong Kong, and reveals film of Han's Lieutenant O'Hara and Han's nearby island. Braithwaite breaks down that he enrolled Lee in an island tournament, but Lee is to work with his double agent Mei Ling to gather evidence of Han's criminal drug trafficking and prostitution of young women like Mary King, whose body was discovered in the harbor. Lee flashes back to a village where a group of Han's men attack Lee's sister, who fights, runs, and instead of getting caught, kills herself, prompting Lee to visit her grave before his departure. Actually, it wasn't really his flashback, which was sort of weird, but it plays.
It's one of those weird things where it's the flashback, I guess, told by his father. Is it his father?
Is that what that was? I couldn't figure that part out.
I think that was his father. I think
a lot of weird things about this movie I want to ask you about when I'm done here. I mean, why do we bother with Roper having like 7 suitcases? Why have that bully at all on the junk going out? Okay, but let me just get through this. In Hong Kong's harbor, White Roper flashes back on a golf game where goons grab him in a glen and try to get his gambling debt of $175,000. But Roper fights them off, returns to the next tee, and prepares to go to Hong Kong. In the harbor, ruddy red rockin' Jim Williams flashes back on his all-black martial arts class, leaving, getting stopped by white cops for no reason, and stopping them and grabbing their car on his way to his hop to Hawaii and Hong Kong. Roper and Williams board a junk, reminisce about their shared Vietnam duty, decry the nearby Chinese ghetto, and note Lee, who neither knows. On the junk's ride out, Roper unsuccessfully bets Lee that a bigger cricket will beat a smaller one. Lee names his own style as fighting without fighting, and Lee tricks a big British bully into a rowboat, which flails and fills with seawater as the ship's kids laugh. On the island, the guest disembark, see scores of martial artists training, bring their luggage up to the palace, and attend a lavish, well-scored Chinese fixture-full dinner that gets graced with a gong and the ingress of Han, who freezes his wrestlers, welcomes his guests, and expresses his gratitude and aptitude. White Tanya visits the guests' rooms and offers ladies for escort services, to which Williams chooses several. Roper chooses Tanya, and Lee chooses Mei Ling, who confides that after girls have private dates with Han, they're never seen again. This is another plot detail that's never seen again. With pomp and ceremony and Han on a throne, the daytime tournament begins with Williams and Roper separately demonstrating their skills in the large grass arena, and then at night in the bedroom. Meanwhile, like a more cat-like 007, Lee sneaks into an underground series of mysterious rooms, gets discovered, knocks out a few guards, and escapes, observed by Williams, who dubs Lee a human fly. At the start of the next day's tournament, Han announces that last night 4 of his guards failed him, so he brings out the muscular Bolo, who crunches each to death in turn. In the tournament, O'Hara faces Lee, who grounds him roundly and soundly until a defeated O'Hara insists on breaking 2 bottles together and lunging, for which Lee delivers a death blow to hear Han lamenting O'Hara disgracing the competition. Han brings Williams to his office, accuses him of knocking out his guards, grills him about the interloper, bars him from leaving the island, 6'4" guards on him, watches Williams knock them out, and fights Williams himself, crashing them into a harem, and then using his secret fake metal hand to knock Williams out as the women laugh. Han gives Roper a personal tour that starts with pulling a guillotine rope that actually activates an elevator down into the underground lair, where Han introduces his daughters and personal guard, who roll over Roper, reveals his opium production, asks Roper to represent him in the US, points to cells full of wastrels, expresses awareness of Roper's gambling debts, and shows Williams strung up, bloody, and, for not answering questions, suspended above a deadly pool until Han signals the rope cut and Roper signals he's on board. Lee bags a deadly cobra, sneaks into the lair, clears a radio booth by throwing in the cobra, and sets off a loud alarm, spurring one of cinema's longest, greatest action scenes as Lee fights and defeats a couple of dozen guards one by one, but gets duped into a cell as Han gloats. I mean, nothing I say can do justice to that scene. Nothing anyone says can. At the next day's tournament, Han commands Roper to fight Lee, but Roper refuses and is redirected to fight Bolo, even as Mei Ling goes downstairs and frees the dozens of prisoners. When Roper defeats Bolo, Han sends almost all the white-robed spectators after Roper and Lee, who tug, tussle, and take turns ass-kicking until a full melee ensues of white robes versus black robes. I didn't know that the black robes were against them until that scene. Han unscrews his hand, replaces it with a sort of bear claw, and attacks Lee, who sticks that claw in Han's throne, comes close to defeating him, but sees him escape inside his temple, where he screws on a new hand that looks exactly like a 4-blade version of Wolverine's signature triple claw, the comic book character. Now, I want to quickly say this film came out a year before Wolverine was created. If it was just for that, this might be one of the most influential films. Lee accuses Han of disgracing his family and Shaolin, fights, endures several claw marks. He looks just like a Wolverine victim, fights, follows Han into a hall of mirrors, fights, breaks the mirrors to remove Han's advantage, fights, and finally kicks Han onto an impaling spear. Far too late, Braithwaite's helicopters approach the island as Lee and Roper give each other exhausted thumbs ups. Okay, Kieron, what do we think? Final time I'm asking this question. What stands out? Does this film
what does stand out? I'm just trying to think about all the different things that I like about the film. And some of the things that you had mentioned. I
know I feel like I was almost giving the film a hard time. It does leave things dangling. I get why they were doing that, just in case they were going to bring stuff back later.
They're hedging their bets too, as far as like who was going to, first of all, whether Bruce Lee was going to, there were different things going on that shut down the production a few different times, where they weren't sure whether Bruce Lee was going to like finish the film necessarily as well.
I think obligated to the other film at the same time, right?
There's obligation to the other film, but also they were looking at, from what I heard, they're also looking, him and Robert Klaus were also looking at other scripts as well. They were being fed to them by Warner Brothers as well, which is kind of.
Finish the one film first? I don't get that, but yes.
Yeah, well, that's what Weintraub and the other producer said. Why were you sort of messing with our production by doing that? So
I think that's a reasonable question.
Yeah, it's a reasonable question, but also too, I think there was still just a sort of last minute, not even sure like what to call the actual movie title as well, and whether or not I think John Saxon sort of assumed until he actually started to meet and work with Bruce that he was essentially promised to be the actual lead of the film, which is why he agreed to do it. Yeah, from what I understand.
That's so, that just frustrates me. It just goes to show you that we still didn't think we could have like.
No, they were very much hedging their bets at that point.
Right.
Like very, very, very much so. This was very, very, very much a pioneering movie literally, because at the last minute essentially, and
Yeah.
Bruce knew essentially that depending on how the film was edited, it could be edited in a certain way where he would sort of be a background character, so to speak, depending on how things shook out essentially.
That's so awful to me.
Yeah.
I watched Way of the Dragon just before, or I'm sorry, I watched it this week also, just to remind myself, like what Bruce Lee did when he was writing and directing, and the only time he ever got the chance to do that. And yeah, it's a little more, it's funny because there's no way that movie is not the Bruce Lee's character story. Like they couldn't have, the way it's structured. I mean, he goes to Rome. The whole thing is like his kind of weird adventure. So that it's
well, that's the one with Chuck Norris, right?
Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
And the final fight with him and Chuck Norris, in some ways, is kind of better than any single fight in Enter the Dragon. But that's okay. I mean, I still think this is the first. If you've never seen a Bruce Lee film, this is the one to start with for many reasons. I think Enter the Dragon still is.
Yeah, I think so as well. Yeah, I think for the most part, actually, all the characters I actually enjoy, regardless of whether or not they're well written or whether the motivations are clear necessarily. I think I do think there might be different edits also too. I think I saw the film twice, and I saw two different versions where there were like a few extra scenes missing that might have cleared some things up. Because this is the other collection that became another Criterion collection that I found out recently too.
Okay.
So, and I think that version also has a few more scenes in it than the one that I normally have seen before, including like some extra things involving Jim Kelly, like sort of being told, or most everybody sort of being told to not go outside at night, essentially, before you actually go out at night, right?
Right.
So there's that, for example. Also, let's see, I think the Hall of Mirrors is really just a good sort of final set piece, whether or not
it works.
Yeah, and there's definitely a generational reason for Bruce to play with that particular actor also, because of the films that he had starred in before that, right? He's very, very important in that way. And also using the Hall of Mirrors also sort of disguised the age, I think, as well, as far as making sure that the scenes looked as impressive as they were. But also just really, I don't know if this is the first time you ever see Bolo Yeung in films, because he's kind of the go-to sort of bad guy. Didn't he play the same character in A Fistful of Yen
Didn't he play the same character in all of his films? I mean, I never saw.
Well, no, I mean, like, didn't he play remember The Fistful of Yen was like a parody for Kentucky Fried Movement? I'm trying to remember if they got Bolo for that as well.
Right, I think he did literally, like, he's called Bolo at times.
Yeah,
it's funny, like they just because people know him from this so much that like why
exactly
name. Yeah, that's hilarious.
Yeah, I mean this film also it should just have it made me sort of realize I need to go back and look at Angela Mao's films also too, because just that one scene that was promised essentially just to give Bruce Lee's character a backstory was just a knockout scene anyway, and she was kind of like a really big star for a little bit in the 70s as well.
Right. I like the way that film is that scene is shot. I like
a lot of good overhead shots, right?
Yeah, no, but it really works. Like you're following it's unusual the way it's staged. I think it's really impressive, actually.
Yeah, I mean, there's some overhead sort of like later on of Bruce sort of practicing as well that sort of mirror the same thing as well.
Oh yeah, I could watch that kind of thing all day. In fact, I was like, oh my god, can't they put the camera up here a little more often? Yeah.
But, yeah, I think Bruce didn't think of this particular plot as anything sort of like more than just a showcase sort of movie for him to go into bigger things. And ironically enough,
it's so sad. Go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, and ironically enough, Robert Klaus did the same thing, or tried to do the same thing 7 years later for Jackie Chan for that movie, The Big Brawl.
That's right.
Yeah.
But at least Jackie Chan movies, well, learning from Enter the Dragon, would have more unity of action, where like if they introduce a guy with 7 suitcases or a bully on a boat, there's a reason you're gonna see him later. You see
the bully later. You see him getting dispatched by Jim Kelly essentially in that
Oh,
match.
okay. Oh, that's who he fought.
Yeah, that's who it was. It was that same
Okay.
guy.
Oh,
Yeah.
wow. I didn't even. I guess all white people look the same. I'm sorry,
I
but
know.
I
And you said
couldn't
he
tell.
was. Did you say he was British or something? I think he was actually from
Uh,
New Zealand.
Oh, I'm sorry. He was Kiwi, wasn't he? Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
Um,
I feel like I want to hasten when I just said the word sad, it occurred to me that there might be some crazy listener out there somewhere who doesn't know exactly what happened when this movie came out. So let me just
yes.
quickly get
Go
that.
ahead. Do that.
Uh, Enter the Dragon's Hong Kong release was scheduled for July 26, 1973. 6 days earlier, on July 20th, Bruce Lee shockingly died at the age of 32. Probably Lee died from cerebral edema, a condition he had evinced a couple of months earlier, but the swelling of his brain may have also been aggravated by his consumption of Equagesic. Lee's funeral, I mean, we're not here to talk about the mystery of Lee's death. It's a crazy, horrible thing. Lee's funeral in Seattle took place on the same day as the world premiere of Enter the Dragon, which is also crazy. Meanwhile, it wasn't scheduled to open in the US for a month. Warner Brothers spent that time ramping up its already expensive marketing campaign to include sponsored karate classes, thousands of illustrated flip books, comic books, posters, photographs, and dozens of news releases, interviews, and public appearances for the stars. After the film was released in the United States on August 19th, exactly 30 days after Lee's death, the film became one of the US's biggest hits of 1973, earning more than $100 million worldwide on its initial release, something very few films had then done. But then it went on to do tremendous business over the next few years in Britain, France, Germany, Greece, Japan, Korea, India, Iran, and other countries throughout the 1970s. Here's Warner Brothers like thinking, oh, wait, should we make John Saxon the star? Do you not realize what you've got here? You've got lightning in a bottle. I mean, like, I don't know what to say. I mean, like, they were I give Warner Brothers credit for like casting white and black actors in a Hong Kong production. I mean, they knew they were increasing the curiosity factor around the world, and that was smart. Would that more people had at least that level of smarts. I mean, what can you say? That's what's missing in other Bruce Lee films is that level of that kind of trio.
Yeah, I agree.
And that works. It's just a shame. Well, no, they would do it with other, but just not with Bruce Lee because we didn't get to have him in. So Enter the Dragon, or if you call it a spy film, it earned more money than any other spy film until 1995's Golden Eye. That's crazy. I think Scott Mendelson, a critic, argues, and I love this argument, if Lee had lived, Enter the Dragon would have served as his Dr. No, which, the plot kind of resembles.
Exactly.
It could have been the foundation of a franchise that could have rivaled or even surpassed the James Bond franchise. And I really think it could have, because it would have been perceived as less imperialist, as you were just saying, in places like India, Iran, Bruce Lee was 10 years younger at his death than Sean Connery was when he began playing James Bond. Think about what we lost there. I mean, granted, if Bruce Lee, if he lived to today, if he made it to his 80s, okay, fine. He probably wouldn't have been able to do quite as many moves as he was doing in that movie. But still, there would have been a few good years there.
There would have been. You could just follow Jackie Chan's career.
Well,
right.
I mean, and granted, Chan actually has probably a better sense of humor than Bruce Lee ever had. Well, at least on screen. I don't know what the scripts were.
But also, I'm just thinking of the physical dexterity that he's remained.
Sure. Oh, no,
Story,
absolutely.
so.
As everybody knows, Jackie Chan is in this movie. I was watching it. I was pausing to find Chan, and you can see him if you try. He's getting beat up. He's a goon that gets beat up more than once. Yeah. It's fine. If one criteria for any canon is influence, and it surely is, then no film canon is really complete without Enter the Dragon, which can lay fair claim to the most influential martial arts film ever made, and one of the most influential action films, period. Enter the Dragon created mainstream worldwide interest in martial arts, as well as inspiring numerous fictional works, including action films, television shows, fighting games, comic books, manga, and anime. Actually, the show Kung Fu was not fully greenlit until after this movie came out. So that's one, but that big deal. That was
Oh, interesting. Yeah. Okay. I didn't realize that.
many believe that the opening fight against the renowned Sammy Hong founded mixed martial arts, or as everybody knows it now, MMA. I already said that just inventing Wolverine's claws would qualify as like not a small influence. As you know, one thing I love about, just as I said, there was not a single N word in Cotton Comes to Harlem. There's not a single gun in Enter the Dragon, and I love that about the movie. It influenced like modern martial arts films in all kinds of ways, but one of those was making them a little less gun heavy.
Right.
And I think you can see that in the later catalog of Jackie Chan. I'm not saying you're never going to find a Jackie Chan movie with a gun. That's a stupid thing to say. I'm saying less than it looked like it was going to be, if you'd just gone by early 70s films prior to Enter the Dragon.
Yeah, I agree with that.
In the documentary, The Slanted Screen, several Asian male actors salute Bruce Lee while also problematizing his influence because, and I'm paraphrasing, they felt that they let people down when they didn't have Lee's martial arts skills. One tiny issue I have with Enter the Dragon, and this is not one that we can just talk about like where they were just hedging their bets. Roper and Williams are frolicking with women at the same time that Lee is sneaking into the underground opium factory to kick some ass. Now, I totally get that. I mean, watching the movie, it works, but one reason that Bruce Lee isn't 007, it's not only because he doesn't need a gun, it's also because he doesn't even entertain the notion of kissing a woman. This is also the case in The Way of the Dragon, which is, so
There's another film where that does happen, though. I'm trying to remember which one.
There is. I want to say in Big Boss, I think it happens.
Yeah.
But I'm just saying the world got to know Bruce Lee as a basically sort of desexualized, like dynamo of fighting, which is cool. But it also eventually didn't really do Asian male actors a lot of favors. Let's just say.
Yeah.
So it's time to ask, what can we say about all 5 of these films together, Kieron?
I was thinking of a few different things, but I was having a difficult time sort of tying all the films to a few of these themes. One of them is like the pursuit of power leads to corruption.
Okay. Yep.
You could see that like in Cotton Comes to Harlem, right? Little Big Man with General Custer, right? Because he's trying to.
They're all kind of anti-establishment films in one way or the other, sort of. I mean,
Yeah, there's no like one particular person in Sweetback necessarily who's like the embodiment of that particular theme, but you could say like the character who like gives Sweetback away essentially could be doing that, I suppose, but that's not necessarily for his own in particular powerful gain necessarily, like some of the other characters. I was thinking about the effect of colonialism on indigenous peoples. That sort of seems to like be.
Yeah, I think all these movies are kind of aware of that. I mean, clearly, I think Enter the Dragon and Little Big Man are very aware of that. But I think even the blaxploitation films are somewhat aware of that.
I would say so as well.
Yeah,
and they're differing views about that too. Like. Especially with Cotton Comes to Harlem, how everything is about, these particular police are sort of like, trusted. They're police, but they're also people like, within the community in a sense, right? As far as we know. Which is something that, I guess you could say that there's like issues about, policemen sort of like not living in their communities that they serve always necessarily.
Great.
Right.
Yes.
So, which makes me think of the police and marginalized society is part of that as well too.
Yep.
Is another part of that. It's just an extension of that theme. Those are the main ones I was thinking of that sort of connected them all together.
Yeah, it's all very Nixon administration-y, very like, the rules changed, or we can look at it in a new way. I mean, and by Nixon administration, I don't mean that these movies promoted Nixon. I mean, when we go back and look in the movies that came out during that administration, there's a lot of alienation. There's a lot of like, there's edginess, grittiness. I mean, I think we see all that here. You know, it's great that Bruce Lee, who kind of would, in my opinion, would have been so amazing in any era, just happens to be in this era too, because it's such an edgy, kind of gritty time for filmmaking. So as soon as you see him walk in, and you also are in the early 70s, you're like, oh, this is great. This is when colors were sort of, you know, that it's not polished the way that it would be later with Jackie Chan,
Right.
I think, which it actually, I mean, it's nice that Jackie Chan and Jet Li and other films are a little more polished in some ways. I mean, it is nice, but there is something sort of raw and kind of beautiful about this era, about seeing Pam Grier run around and kick ass in this era, about these other films too, you know. And yeah, I mean, it's special. It's a special era. I can't imagine. I mean, I would I have written about this era in a book if I didn't care? I mean, I think
Exactly.
something about the early 70s I just go back to, you know, and I like it there, you know.
Yeah, I do too as well. So I'm finding more and more about the 70s. I think this is just something that we're all sort of like going back to, especially with a decade in particular that I just don't really remember much of personally.
Well, no, I don't think you and
Also,
I were expected just because we were born then to like necessarily remember it.
yeah, there are like very few. I think the only things I remember were Bicentennial and Carter getting elected, and that's about it as far as like big things. And Iran, of course, after that. But yes.
Segue to my outro, except before I do that, I want to thank you, Kieron, so much for coming on. You really upped your game and made a terrific podcast for the people. Thank you for that.
I appreciate it. I appreciate you always having me on. And this was also just a fun group of films to talk about as well. And also just, it was fun to discuss them with you as always.
I tried to save you some fun ones this time. Right. We didn't have to discuss Johnny Got His Gun or some of the really...
Well, I would discuss that one. I mean,
well, sure. Just a little less fun. I mean, you know.
Yeah, I agree.
Just a notch less, yeah. But no, thank you again. And I look forward to the next time you grace my podcast with your presence. That would be awesome.
I do as well. Yeah.
But okay, so as you were saying, it's fun to look through the 70s, and that's what we're going to be doing continuing next week with some groups that maybe didn't get as much attention in this podcast. As we continue down the road of the milestones of the marginalized, next week's films will be Blazing Saddles, Dog Day Afternoon, The Rocky Horror Picture Show, Up in Smoke, and Stir Crazy. I hope you'll join me. Until then, save me some popcorn because there's always another movie to see.